In 1845, the British Royal Navy sent 129 men into the Arctic on what was supposed to be the greatest exploration mission in history. They had enough food for 3 years, steam engines, silver cutlery, and a library of 1,200 books. They had 2 of the strongest ships ever built. They were never seen alive again. Tonight, we find out what happened to the Franklin expedition. Welcome to Moonlight Mysteries, a calm space for long, research-rich mysteries. If you enjoy these sleepy deep dives, please like this video, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss new episodes. If you'd like to support the channel, a quick comment with your favorite moment helps more people find us. Now settle in, dim the lights, and let's begin. The Franklin Expedition. Part 1. The Dream at the Top of the World. For as long as ships have sailed, people have wanted to know what lay beyond the edge of the known. That impulse is so deeply human that it almost defies analysis. The desire to look past the last known point, to find a name for the place on the map, where the cartographer simply wrote terra incognita, unknown land. In the 19th century, the great geographic obsession of the British Empire was a body of water that many suspected did not exist, and which others were convinced would change the world if it did. It was called the Northwest Passage, a sea route threading through the labyrinth of the Arctic islands above Canada, linking the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. If a ship could navigate it, Europe would have a shortcut to Asia that bypassed the long, treacherous journey around the southern tip of South America, or the Cape of Good Hope at the bottom of Africa. Trade would be faster. The empire would extend its reach. In England, already the most powerful maritime nation on earth, would have proven once more that it could do what no one else could do. This ambition was not new, and what made it grip the Victorians so completely was precisely how old it was, how many centuries of failure had accumulated around the idea without extinguishing it. Europeans had been looking for the Northwest Passage since 1497, when John Cabot sailed out of Bristol under the flag of King Henry VII and returned, having found North America, but not a passage through it. He had at least confirmed that there was a continent in the way, which was more than anyone else had known before. Martin Frobisher tried in 1576, 1577, and 1578 3 separate expeditions, each one returning to England with increasingly embarrassing quantities of pyrite, the iron ore his men had mistaken for gold, and no passage. Frobisher's expeditions did at least make it into what is now called Frobisher's Bay on Baffin Island, giving the search a foothold in the Canadian Arctic. Francis Drake passed through the Strait of Magellan at the bottom of South America in 1577 and saw the open Pacific, which suggested to some that there might be an equivalent northern route, but Drake, being Drake, had other priorities. Henry Hudson is perhaps the most melancholy figure in the long history of the search. He made 4 voyages in search of northern routes to Asia between 1607 and 1611, working first for the English Muscovy Company and then for the Dutch East India Company, before returning to English employment for his final voyage. In 1609, sailing for the Dutch, he pushed up the river that now bears his name in what is today New York, going far enough to establish that it was a river and not a strait before turning back. In 1610, with English funding, he finally found the enormous bay now called Hudson Bay and spent the winter locked in its ice with a crew that was mutinous almost from the start. When the ice released them in June 1611, the crew's patience gave out entirely. They put Hudson, his teenage son John, and 7 loyal or sick crewmen into a small open boat, a shallop, essentially a large rowboat, and cast them adrift in the bay. Hudson, his son, and the others were never seen again. The mutineers sailed home and were not executed. The bay was enormous and tantalizing, and led nowhere useful, but it had Hudson's name on it, and the Hudson's Bay Company would eventually be founded in 1670 to exploit the fur trade of its shores, making the Hudson voyages commercially significant, even if they never found a passage. William Baffin and Robert Bylot sailed north into the bay now called the Baffin Bay in 1616 and mapped its coastlines with impressive accuracy. Baffin even identified the entrances to Lancaster Sound, Smith Sound, and Jones Sound, all of which would later prove to be genuine openings into the Arctic. But he reported them blocked by ice and concluded that no passage existed in that direction. His maps were so accurate that later navigators who could not reconcile what they saw with what he had charted assumed he was wrong, and his work was discredited for nearly 2 centuries before being vindicated by the very expeditions that finally found the passage he had identified. James Cook approached from the other direction. In 1778, on his 3rd and final voyage, Cook was specifically tasked with finding the western entrance to the Northwest Passage by sailing north along the coast of North America from California. He got as far as Icy Cape in what is now Alaska before the pack ice stopped him. He turned back, was killed in Hawaii the following year in a skirmish with islanders, and the Pacific approach was filed away as a dead end until someone could penetrate it from the west with better ships. The net result of 300 years of searching was a considerable quantity of useful geographical knowledge, a large number of dead explorers, and absolutely no successful navigation of a Northwest Passage. The passage was beginning to seem less like a geographical feature and more like a collective delusion, a story sailors told themselves to justify going to places that were cold, remote, and inhospitable, and where they tended to die. Part 2. The Man Who Invented Arctic Fever. Everything changed after 1815, and the reason it changed was a single man with an extraordinary combination of administrative power, genuine intellectual passion, and a talent for self-promotion that shaded, occasionally, into something less generous. John Barrow was born in 1764 in a small village in Lancashire, the son of a farmer, and by the time he was 40 years old, he had become the 2nd Secretary of the Admiralty, the permanent, non-political senior administrator of the most powerful naval force on Earth. He held that position for 41 years, from 1804 to 1845, and in that time, he became in effect the architect of British polar exploration. He was a geographer, an author, a tireless correspondent, a committee man of genius, and a person who held grudges with formidable persistence. What drove Barrow's Arctic obsession was partly genuine intellectual interest. He had traveled widely and written serious geographical works, and partly the particular opportunity created by the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. Britain emerged from those wars with the largest and most capable navy in the world, and almost no enemies left to fight. Officers who had spent their careers in action found themselves on half pay, restless, ambitious, and with nothing to do. Ships sat idle in harbor. The institutional machine of the Royal Navy required employment, and Barrow, who had been hearing reports from whaling captains about unusually open water in the Arctic, reports that suggested the ice might be retreating, saw a solution. He pitched the Admiralty on a program of polar exploration as a patriotic, scientific, and commercially valuable enterprise that would keep the Navy busy, map the last unknown region of the Earth, and potentially open new trade routes. The Admiralty agreed, and in 1818 sent out the first of what would become an extraordinary sequence of expeditions over the next 3 decades. The 1818 expeditions were a matched pair, one under Captain David Buchan, with a young officer named John Franklin as his second in command, would try to sail directly over the North Pole, based on the fashionable theory of an open polar sea. The idea that the constant summer sunlight above the Arctic Circle kept a ring of water around the pole permanently ice-free. The other under Captain John Ross, with Lieutenant William Edward Parry as his second, would probe west from Baffin Bay in search of a passage through the islands. Both expeditions failed to achieve their main objectives, but in ways that set up everything that came after. Buchan and Franklin were stopped by ice well short of the pole and turned back. This was not disgraceful. The open polar sea theory was wrong, but widespread, and the ice north of Spitsbergen is reliably impenetrable. Franklin's role in the expedition was unremarkable, and his career at this point gave no particular indication of what it would become. John Ross's expedition is where things get interesting, and where the personal rivalries that would shape Arctic exploration for the next 30 years begins to take shape. Ross's ships, HMS Isabella and HMS Alexander, pushed into Baffin Bay and found their way to the entrance of Lancaster Sound, a wide and inviting opening to the west that Baffin had noted 2 centuries earlier. Ross sailed 30 miles in, and then, in conditions of poor visibility and uncertain weather, he saw, or believed he saw, a range of mountains blocking the western end of the sound, enclosing it completely and rendering further progress pointless. He named these mountains the Kroger Mountains, after the first Secretary of the Admiralty, and he turned back. The problem was that William Parry and the Alexander, which had fallen somewhat behind the Isabella in the Sound, could not see any mountains at all. He could see open water as far as his eyes could carry. He was baffled by his commander's decision to retreat and communicated his doubts privately to members of the Admiralty when he returned to England. Within months, Ross's report was being questioned in official circles, and Barrow, who was furious that his flagship expedition had returned with what he considered a failure of nerves, was using his position at the Admiralty and his anonymous contribution to the Quarterly Review to savage Ross's reputation publicly and privately. The Kroger Mountains, it would turn out, did not exist. They were most likely a mirage, an optical phenomenon common in Arctic conditions, where temperature inversions bend light in ways that can produce convincing images of solid land that isn't there. Ross had seen a mountain range that had never existed and used it to justify cutting short an expedition that, had it continued, might have found the Northwest Passage 25 years before Franklin was sent to look for it. Lancaster Sound is in fact the entrance to Barrow Strait, the long east-west corridor through the Arctic archipelago along which most subsequent expeditions would travel. Ross had turned around at the doorstep of everything. Barrow dispatched Parry back the following year, 1819, in his own command aboard HMS Hecla with HMS Gribber. Parry sailed straight through the Phantom Kroger Mountains into Lancaster Sound, continued west through Barrow Strait, named for Barrow, and made it all the way to Melville Island before the ice finally stopped him, becoming the first man to winter deliberately in the high Arctic. He had sailed further west through the Canadian Arctic than anyone would manage again from the eastern approach for 80 years. His men spent the winter in remarkable good health, partly because Parry was an exceptionally good commander who understood the psychological and physical demands of polar wintering. He organized theatrical performances, a ship's newspaper, regular exercises, and reading classes to keep his men occupied and their morale high. When he returned to England in 1820, he was a hero. Parliament had offered £5,000 to the first ship to cross the 110th meridian within the Arctic Circle, and Parry had earned it. He became the dominant figure in British Arctic exploration for the decade that followed. John Ross, meanwhile, was effectively blacklisted from Admiralty employment. Barrow's enmity was precise and patient. Ross was never again given a Royal Navy appointment for Arctic work. He spent years in the cold, watching Parry and others receive the commands and the glory that he believed should have been his, writing increasingly bitter pamphlets and correspondence defending his 1818 decision. Barrow attacked him in print, anonymously, in the Quarterly Review. Ross attacked back, sometimes also anonymously, sometimes not. Their quarrel was one of the great public controversies of early Victorian intellectual life, filling pages of the respectable press with accusations and counter-accusations from men who had been to the same stretches of ice and disagreed entirely about what they had seen. Parry went back to the Arctic 3 more times. His second expedition, 1821 to 1823, explored the Fox Basin and the Melville Peninsula, and found the Fury and Hecla Strait, a potential southern route that turned out to be too shallow and ice-choked to use. His third, 1824 to 1825, ended when HMS Fury was wrecked on the shore of Somerset Island in a storm. Her stores cached on the beach at what became known as Fury Beach, a supply depot that would be used by subsequent expeditions, including John Ross's second attempt, and could have been reached by the survivors of Franklin's expedition if they had gone a different direction. Parry's fourth and final Arctic expedition in 1827 was not a passage attempt at all, but a bid for the furthest north record using sledge teams on the sea ice north of Spitsbergen. He got to about 82 degrees 45 minutes north, the highest latitude reached by a European until 1875, a record that stood for nearly 50 years. And then there was John Ross's second expedition, which is one of the stranger and more instructive stories in the whole history of Arctic exploration. Having been shut out of Admiralty funding, Ross went private. He found a patron in Felix Booth, the owner of Booth's Gin, one of the most successful distilling businesses in England, and convinced Booth to fund a private expedition using a small steam-powered vessel called Victory. Steam engines and ships were still new and unreliable in 1829, and the Victory's engine was a particular disaster. It broke down repeatedly, was eventually thrown overboard, and the ship completed most of its journey under sail. But Ross pushed further south into the channel south of Lancaster Sound than anyone had gone before, and his nephew James Clark Ross, a man who had already been on 5 polar expeditions by this point, and who was one of the most capable and experienced polar scientists in the world, made a sledge journey in the spring of 1831 that located the magnetic North Pole on the Boothia Peninsula. This was a genuinely significant scientific achievement. The magnetic North Pole is the point on the Earth's surface where the planet's magnetic field points directly downward, and its location was of practical importance for navigation. Compass needles don't point to true north, but to magnetic north, and knowing exactly where magnetic north was allowed navigators to calculate the difference between the two and correct their bearings accordingly. James Clark Ross planted a flag at the magnetic pole and claimed it for Britain, and the discovery gave the otherwise troubled expedition a triumphant conclusion. The Victory was eventually abandoned in the ice after 4 winters, a record at that point for any ship deliberately wintering in the Arctic, and Ross and his men walked out to Fury Beach, where Parry's cash supplies sustained them through one more winter before they were rescued by a whaling ship in 1833. They had been given up for dead. John Ross's return was the great sensation that year, the newspapers full of his miraculous survival, and even Barrow had to acknowledge that whatever else could be said about the man, he had survived 4 Arctic winters when everyone assumed he was dead. Ross was knighted, and the long public quarrel with Barrow settled into a cold mutual contempt. All of this forms the context in which Franklin's 1845 expedition was planned and launched. By 1845, the combined work of these expeditions had mapped the Canadian Arctic to a remarkable degree of completeness. The unknown stretch of water between the known western extent of Parry's route along Barrow Strait and the known northern coast of the Canadian mainland, which Franklin and others had mapped in their overland expeditions, was approximately 500 kilometers of uncharted sea. Someone had to fill that last blank, and the pressure to do it, after 30 years of trying, was enormous. The Arctic was, for the Victorians, simultaneously a place of terror and of transcendence. The journals and published accounts of the expeditions, edited, polished, and sold to large audiences who read them with the intense vicarious excitement that people in later centuries would reserve for space exploration, described a landscape of overwhelming silence and beauty, of enormous ice formations glittering in perpetual summer light, of phenomena like the aurora borealis that had no adequate counterpart in the experience of someone who had never left England. The Arctic was sublime in the precise philosophical sense, a natural environment of such overwhelming scale and indifference that it produced in the observer a complex mixture of awe and terror, a sense of human smallness against nature's enormity. The Admiralty fed this popular appetite by publishing the accounts of its Arctic expeditions, which sold in large quantities and made minor celebrities of officers who returned with good stories and presentable prose styles. Parry was the decade's great hero. James Clark Ross, with his Antarctic achievements and his finding of the magnetic pole, was celebrated. These were the heroes of the age, not soldiers, not scientists, but something the Victorians had a particular word for: explorers. And woven through all of it was the complicated figure of Barrow himself, now 82 years old in 1845, still at the Admiralty, nearing the very end of his tenure. He had spent the better part of 4 decades sending ships and men into the Arctic, accumulating enormous geographical knowledge at the cost of significant human suffering, and the Northwest Passage was still not done. The prize that justified the whole enterprise, the prize he had promised Parliament and the public alike, remained elusive. He wanted it solved before he died. He believed with the optimism that had always characterized his thinking that the remaining stretch was navigable, that a well-equipped expedition could thread through it in a single season. The problem of the Northwest Passage, he wrote in a Quarterly Review article, was nearly solved. All that was needed was the right man and the right ships. The choice of that man and the preparation of those ships would become one of the most examined decisions in the history of exploration. Part 3. The Man Who Ate His Boots. John Franklin was born on April 16, 1786, in Spilsby, Lincolnshire, a market town in a flat agricultural corner of eastern England, the 9th of 12 children of a prosperous merchant family. By his own account, he was a restless and impractical boy, not especially academic, given to wandering and daydreaming, with a fascination for the sea that his family tried to redirect toward a career in the church. A brief visit to the coast at age 9 apparently settled the matter for him permanently. He joined the Royal Navy in 1800 at the age of 14 and never seriously considered any other life. His early career was the kind that builds a solid naval officer, not spectacular, but comprehensive. He was present at the Battle of Copenhagen in 1801, the engagement in which the British fleet under Vice Admiral Hyde Parker and the insubordinate, inspired brilliance of Rear Admiral Horatio Nelson destroyed a Danish fleet to prevent Denmark aligning with Napoleon. He then served on HMS Investigator, his first encounter with the ship that bore that name, on Matthew Flinders' survey of the coast of Australia from 1801 to 1803. Flinders was one of the great navigators of the age, and the voyage gave the young Franklin his foundational training in precise coastal survey work, the kind of detailed observation and measurement that would define his scientific contributions in the Arctic decades later. He was at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, serving as a signals midshipman on HMS Bellerophon, one of the ships of the line at the center of Nelson's attack on the Franco-Spanish fleet off Cape Trafalgar. He was on the deck when Nelson was shot. He was close enough to the action that the Bellerophon was one of the most heavily engaged ships of the battle, suffering heavier casualty than almost any other vessel. Years later, Franklin remembered watching the flagship Victory's signal run up the mast, just before the lines of ships closed. England expects that every man will do his duty. He served with apparent distinction in a battle, in which the distinction was crowded and competition for it was fierce. He was wounded in the War of 1812, at the Battle of Lake Borgne, in December 1814, one of the skirmishes around the British assault on New Orleans. With the Peace of 1815 and the sudden end of the naval war, Franklin found himself in the same position as hundreds of other naval officers, on half pay, his career at an uncertain pause, looking for something useful to do. The Arctic was what the Admiralty offered him. In 1818, he was given command of HMS Trent, the second ship of David Buchan's North Pole expedition, the one that was attempting to sail directly over the top of the world to the Pacific via the open polar sea. They were stopped by ice off Spitsbergen, as anyone with accurate knowledge of the Arctic would have predicted, and Franklin returned to England without particular distinction. He was 32 years old and had accomplished little that was individually noteworthy. The following year changed everything. In 1819, Franklin was given command of a small overland expedition whose goal was to travel from Hudson Bay to the Arctic Ocean, descend the Coppermine River to the sea, and map the northern coast of Canada eastward from the river's mouth. It was, on paper, a straightforward surveying mission. In practice, it became one of the most catastrophic and darkly fascinating episodes in the history of British exploration. The expedition that departed England in the spring of 1819 included Franklin, 3 other British officers who would all become distinguished in their own right, Dr. John Richardson, a Royal Navy surgeon of exceptional skill and intellect, who would become a close friend and lifelong collaborator, Midshipman George Back, a competitive and sometimes difficult young man who was a brilliant artist and would go on to his own important Arctic career, and Midshipman Robert Hood, a gifted artist and natural scientist who would not come back. The party spent an exhausting year traveling from Hudson Bay to Great Slave Lake, and then to the vicinity of the Coppermine River, relying on the cooperation of fur trading companies and local indigenous peoples for food and guidance. The cooperation was inconsistent, the season harsh, and Franklin's planning, which assumed a level of support that proved unavailable, began to come apart almost from the start. The party wintered at a place they called Fort Enterprise, on the banks of the Coppermine near Great Slave Lake, in conditions of increasing hardship. There was food enough that winter, barely, but the relationships between the British officers and the mixed group of French-Canadian voyagers and indigenous guides were strained throughout, and there was, at one point, a near duel between Back and Hood over a young Yellowknife woman nicknamed Greenstockings, a moment of almost novelistic absurdity in a story that would soon turn purely tragic. In the summer of 1821, the party reached the Arctic Ocean and mapped about 850 kilometers of coastline before the deteriorating weather and depleted supplies forced them to turn back. The return journey was the catastrophe. Franklin had counted on finding food at a cache at Fort Enterprise that turned out to be empty. The party was traveling through the barren, treeless subarctic plains in October and November with no food and temperatures well below freezing on a terrain that offered no shelter and no game. Men began to die. The survivors ate lichen scraped off rocks, ate old bones found in the snow, ate the leather from their boots and harnesses boiled in water, anything that might yield even minimal nutrition. Franklin himself was so weak that at one point he could barely walk. The expedition split into groups as individuals fell behind. In the rear group, something happened that was whispered about and never fully resolved. The voyager, Michel Terre Haute, one of the few members of the party still physically capable, left camp repeatedly and returned with what he called wolf meat, fresh meat, supposedly scavenged from the carcasses of animals. Dr. Richardson noticed that the meat Michel brought back did not look like wolf. When Midshipman Hood was found shot dead beside the campfire, Michel claiming the young officer had accidentally discharged his own rifle while cleaning it. Richardson looked at the wound and saw that the bullet had entered from behind at close range. He concluded that Michel had murdered Hood. He also concluded from the meat that Michel had been eating the men who had already died of starvation, keeping himself strong by a method he could not reveal. Richardson himself, half-starved and barely able to stand, loaded his pistol at the first opportunity when Michel was distracted and shot him in the head. He then walked with the seaman John Hepburn, the only other surviving member of the rear group, to Fort Enterprise, where they found Franklin and the few survivors of the front group in desperate condition, living in the empty fort, too weak to gather firewood, eating the charred bones and scraps of hide left from previous meals. 11 of the 20 men who had started the expeditions were dead. The survivors were rescued by a party of Yellowknife hunters who had learned of their predicament and brought them food. Franklin recovered slowly in the winter of 1821 to 1822 and returned to England the following year. What is most striking about how this catastrophe was received in England is the disconnect between what happened and what was written about it afterward. Franklin's published account of the expedition, which appeared in 1823, was a careful and measured document, honest about the deaths, but focused on the geographical discoveries and the scientific observations made during the journey, and framed throughout in the language of duty, endurance, and ultimate survival. Murder was mentioned delicately, cannibalism implied but not stated, and the book was a sensation. Second-hand copies sold up to 10 guineas when the first printing ran out. Franklin was promoted, celebrated, made a Fellow of the Royal Society, and eventually knighted. The man who ate his boots became a national figure, a living emblem of British fortitude, and the Coppermine disaster was transmuted in the public imagination from an avoidable catastrophe into a noble ordeal. This transmutation, and Franklin's willingness to accept it, says something important about the man and about the age. He was not, by temperament, a braggart or a self-promoter. Everyone who knew him personally described him in terms that recur with remarkable consistency: kind, gentle, deeply and genuinely religious, loyal to his friends, patient to a degree that occasionally looked like passivity. His biographer would later write that Franklin was not noted for neatness and orderliness as a child, a polite understatement of a man who was constitutionally unsuited for certain aspects of administration. There is a famous anecdote, probably apocryphal but too characteristic to dismiss, of Franklin in the Canadian Barrens, pausing in the middle of his terrible march to blow mosquitoes gently off his skin, rather than swatting them, telling the indigenous hunters watching in amazement that the insect had as much right to live as he did. Whether true or not, the story tells you how people who knew him thought about him. He was a man of profound faith in a profoundly religious age, in that faith seems to have been genuine rather than performative, not the social Christianity of Sunday observance, but something more personal and consistent, a sense that suffering had meaning, and that duty required the full use of one's capacity regardless of the cost. It was this quality, along with his physical courage, that made him famous. It was also arguably this quality that made him a problematic commander, a man too gentle to impose the discipline that Arctic conditions demanded, too trusting of the competence of others, too willing to assume things would work out. In the years between the Coppermine disaster and the second overland expedition, he found unexpected happiness. He married Eleanor Ann Porden in August 1823, a poet and intellectual, well-connected in London literary society, who had written an epic poem about the Arctic before she ever met Franklin. A coincidence that must have seemed auspicious. Their only child, Eleanor Isabella, was born in June 1824, and then Eleanor Porden fell ill with tuberculosis, the disease that haunted Victorian England, and the timing became almost unbearably poignant. She was seriously ill when Franklin prepared to depart for his second Arctic expedition in February 1825. She insisted he go, told him firmly that his duty lay with the expedition, not at her bedside, that she would not be the reason he stayed behind. He sailed on February 16, 1825. She died 6 days later. Franklin did not learn of her death until he reached Canada. He had already been told, as he traveled west, that she was extremely ill. He carried that knowledge through the early stages of the expedition, and then carried the news of her death through the rest of it. Whatever grief he felt was private. His expedition journals show no diminishment in his professional attention during this period. The observations were made, the routes were recorded, the work was done. The second overland expedition, 1825 to 1827, was a different animal from the first entirely. Well-funded, carefully planned, supported by a fully cooperative Hudson Bay Company that had in the intervening years resolved its quarrel with the Northwest Trading Company and was now in a position to actually deliver the food and equipment it promised. The expedition mapped some 1,200 miles of Arctic coastline with impressive precision. The party traveled in purpose-built wooden boats rather than fragile birchbark canoes, with adequate food and a functioning supply chain. At Point Separation on the Mackenzie River Delta, the group divided. Richardson and his attachment went east toward the Coppermine, while Franklin and George Back went west toward Alaska. Franklin very nearly met HMS Blossom, which was working its way east from the Pacific side under Captain Frederick Beechey. They missed each other by only about 160 miles, a near rendezvous that illustrated how thoroughly the northern coast of North America was being mapped from multiple directions simultaneously. Franklin returned to England in 1827 to considerable acclaim. He was knighted in 1829 and married Jane Griffin that same year, a woman who was in almost every external way his opposite. Where he was patient, she was driven. Where he was gentle, she was strategic. Where he drifted, she navigated. They were a genuinely happy and mutually devoted couple, despite, or perhaps because, of those differences. Jane Franklin's intelligence and social energy complemented her husband's warmth and his moral weight in ways that served them both. Then came Tasmania. Franklin was appointed lieutenant governor of Van Diemen's Land, the island colony at the bottom of Australia, used at the time primarily as a destination for transported convicts, in 1836, arriving in Hobart with Jane in January 1837. He was 50 years old and had been away from the Arctic for a decade. The posting was intended as a mark of distinction, a senior colonial appointment that recognized his status as a national figure. But it proved to be the most sustained professional humiliation of his life. Van Diemen's Land in the 1830s and 1840s was run by a system that had calcified under the previous governor, Sir George Arthur, a strict, organized, somewhat authoritarian structure in which the colonial secretary wielded enormous practical power. The colonial secretary, when Franklin arrived, was a man named John Montague, and Montague was everything Franklin was not: politically shrewd, personally ruthless, capable of the kind of bureaucratic infighting that Franklin found both distasteful and baffling. Montague had his own networks, his own connections in London, and his own very firm ideas about how Van Diemen's Land should be governed. Ideas that did not involve deference to a governor whose instincts ran toward liberal reform, science promotion, and what Montague considered naive idealism. Franklin and Jane did genuinely try to improve the colony in ways that deserved more credit than they received. Franklin established a state education system, founded the Tasmanian Natural History Society, which became the first scientific royal society established outside Britain, and promoted intellectual and cultural life in ways that had no precedence in the colony's history. Jane was an extraordinary presence in her own right. She was the first woman to climb Mount Wellington, the mountain that overlooks Hobart, and the first to travel overland from Melbourne to Sydney. She tried to reform the convict system, advocated for more humane treatment of prisoners, and engaged with the scientific communities in ways that made the Hobart of the Franklin years a surprisingly active intellectual center. But the politics of a small, isolated colonial administration proved too much for Franklin's temperament. A series of confrontations with Montague over matters of administrative policy escalated into open warfare. Franklin suspended Montague in early 1842 after a newspaper closely associated with Montague ran a series of articles vilifying both the governor and his wife. Montague traveled to London, used his extensive connections, including his family ties to the previous governor, whose administrative style he had helped shape, and successfully lobbied Lord Stanley at the Colonial Office to reverse Franklin's suspension of him, and effectively censured the governor for mishandling the affair. The Colonial Office dispatched a response that fell just short of a direct reprimand, and Franklin's term of office was brought to a close in August 1843, 6 years after it had begun. He returned to England, feeling, as he said in a letter, that a foul conspiracy had been mounted against him. He was 57 years old. His Arctic reputation, which had made him famous, was now 2 decades old. The Tasmania years had produced no compensating achievement to restore his prestige. He needed something, and the something that presented itself in 1844 was the last expedition to complete the Northwest Passage. Franklin lobbied hard for the command. He wrote to Barrow, to the First Lord of the Admiralty, to everyone who might have influence over the decision. He acknowledged that he was perhaps not as young as the ideal candidate, but argued that his experience, his knowledge of Arctic conditions, and his established relationships within the naval community made him the right man. Some at the Admiralty agreed, while others had reservations they did not press hard enough. Barrow's second choice was William Perry, who declined. He was tired of the Arctic and comfortable in his retirement. James Clark Ross was offered the command and turned it down, having promised his new wife that the recent Antarctic voyage would be his last. Francis Ralden Moira Crozier, who had more polar experience than virtually anyone alive, was offered the lead position and declined it. His reasons were personal as much as professional, bound up with his melancholy and with Sophia Krukow's rejection, which had left him genuinely uncertain about his own capacity for leadership. He agreed to serve as captain of the Terror under Franklin's overall command. When the decision came down to the older, somewhat diminished Franklin or a junior officer whose appointment might cause resentment among the more senior men, Franklin got the command. Whether Lady Jane's advocacy behind the scenes tipped the balance, as some historians have argued, or whether Franklin would have gotten it regardless, is not entirely clear. What is clear is that Sir John Richardson's concern that Franklin was perhaps too old for the command was overwritten by other considerations, including Franklin's own cheerful insistence that he felt perfectly well. He was 58 when he was appointed, 59 when he sailed, 60 when he wintered for the first time in the ice northwest of King William's Island, and 61 when he died on June 11, 1847. The man who ate his boots and survived the unsurvivable in 1821 did not survive this. But by the time he died, having led his expedition safely and competently through its first 2 winters, he may have believed he was on the verge of the thing he had spent 30 years working toward. Whether he died knowing the passage was within reach, or whether he died in ignorance of how close he had come, is one of the many things we will never know for certain. Part 4. The ships. The 2 ships were HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. Erebus, in Greek mythology, is the primordial darkness, the space between the earth and the underworld that souls must cross after death, and the name is apt enough for what followed. Both ships had been bomb vessels originally, built for naval warfare, with unusually strong hulls designed to withstand the enormous recoil of shipboard mortar. HMS Terror had participated in the War of 1812. Among the British ships that bombarded Fort McHenry in Baltimore in September 1814, the Knight Francis Scott Key watched from a prisoner exchange vessel offshore and wrote what would become the Star-Spangled Banner. These were not fragile vessels. They were built to take punishment. By the time they were fitted out for the Arctics, both had been reinforced further. Their bows were sheathed in iron plate, backed with extra layers of oak to resist packed ice pressure. Their hulls were doubled, screw propellers added, and driven by converted railway locomotive engines that could push the ships through broken ice or windless channels. Steam heating was installed below decks. The hulls were fitted with a pipe system that allowed the crew to pump hot water through the ship, keeping the lower decks and officers' quarters at a livable temperature even in the depths of an Arctic winter. The ships also carried a hand organ that could play 50 tunes, a library of 1,200 books, silver cutlery for the officers, 1,000 copies of the satirical magazine Punch, and a daguerreotype camera. The photographic technology barely 5 years old in 1845. The officers took their meals at properly set tables with wine and china. An observer at Greenhithe, where the ships were fitted out before departure, described them as resembling ocean-going country houses more than naval vessels. There was also the food. The expedition carried provisions estimated to last 3 years: salt meat, preserved vegetables, chocolates, lemon juice to prevent scurvy, rum, tobacco, and several thousand tins of preserved food covering meat, vegetable, and soups. Canning was a relatively new technology in 1845, invented by Nicholas Appert in France in the early 19th century, and adopted by the British military as a way to provision troops and sailors in remote locations. The tins were sealed with lead solder, applied by hand at the factory of a man named Stephen Goldner, who had been awarded the contract partly because he offered the lowest price and had accepted the commission late, leaving very little time before departure. Some of the cans that arrived at the ships were unusually large. Some held 8 pounds of food and would have required significant heat and time to cook their contents safely through. Improperly processed tin food, sealed in a rush, is an ideal environment for several things to go wrong, and it would eventually emerge that something had. The ships also carried the machinery of Victorian scientific enterprise, including instruments for magnetic observation. The Admiralty wanted systematic data on the Earth's magnetic field across the high Arctic, which had practical applications for navigation. The magnetic North Pole had been located by James Clark Ross in 1831 on the Boothia Peninsula, and tracking how the field varied was a genuine scientific priority. Franklin's ships were floating laboratories as much as exploration vessels. The men expected to make continuous observations even as they pressed south through the ice. When the ships departed from Greenhithe on May 19, 1845, the crowds that came to see them off were large and enthusiastic. This was a major national event, the kind of departure that warranted press coverage and public spectacle. The men cheered as they moved down the Thames with their families waving from the docks. The expedition carried the weight of national expectation, the sense that this was finally the mission that would close the chapter on the Northwest Passage question. Franklin is said to have been in excellent spirits. The crew numbered 134 men and officers when the ships departed. Among them was Francis Crozier, a 50-year-old Irish officer who commanded the Terror, and then there was James Fitzjames, the third-ranking officer on the expedition and captain of the Erebus, a man whose background was, even by the standards of the age, unusually complicated. Fitzjames was 31 years old in 1845, and he was the illegitimate son of a diplomat named Sir James Gambier. His mother's identity has never been established. He was baptized at St. Marylebone Parish Church in London in 1815, with falsified parentage listed on the register, and he was raised by adoptive relatives in Hertfordshire, who kept his origins carefully concealed. In a society where illegitimacy was a significant social handicap, Fitzjames navigated around the obstacle through genuine talent and the careful cultivation of powerful connections. His biological family's ties to senior Royal Navy figures helped open doors without the relationship being openly acknowledged. He had served in the Euphrates expedition of the 1830s, a disastrous attempt to establish a steamship route through Mesopotamia to India. He had fought with distinction in the Egyptian-Ottoman War and in the First Opium War against China, where he was wounded at the Battle of Xinjiang. He was charming, handsome, and an excellent writer. The letters he sent home from the early stages of the 1845 expedition are some of the liveliest documentary record we have of what life aboard the ships was like in those first hopeful weeks. John Barrow had actually considered Fitzjames as a potential commander of the expedition, a sign of how far the young officer had risen. What he lacked was Arctic experience. He had never sailed in polar waters before joining Franklin's expedition. What he had was drive, social intelligence, and the ability to hold the loyalty of men around him. He appears to have been genuinely well liked by the crew. The 129 men who sailed north included 2 surgeons, Stephen Stanley on the Erebus and John Petty on the Terror, who would have been responsible for monitoring and treating the crew's health throughout the voyage. 2 ice masters, James Reed and Thomas Blanky, men of no particular social standing, but enormous practical knowledge of navigating through pack ice, whose skills were in many ways more directly relevant to the expedition's success than those of many of the officers above them. A complement of Royal Marines whose roles included maintaining discipline and security, and engineers to operate the naval steam engines, which were derived from standard railway locomotive technology and required specialized handling. There were also assistant surgeons, mates, a paymaster, and various ratings whose specific duties ranged from sail-making to carpentry to keeping the fires burning in the heating system below decks. The crew ranged in age from the teenage ratings to officers in their late 40s. They were, by the standard of the time, an excellent and experienced complement of men. They were also critically sailing on 2 ships with extraordinary histories. The Erebus had been built in Pembroke Dockyard in Wales in 1826. The Terror had been launched from Topsham in Devon on 1813. Both had sailed to Antarctica together just a few years earlier, from 1839 to 1843, under James Clark Ross, the same expedition on which Crozier had commanded the Terror, and fallen in love with Sophia Krakow in Van Diemen's Land. They had pushed through to the Ross ice shelf, discovered the volcano Ross named Erebus after his ship, and reached the furthest south that any human beings had ever gone. These were not untested vessels. They had been to the bottom of the world and back, reinforced for those voyages, and reinforced again for the Arctic. They were as well prepared as any ships in the world. The ships stopped at Greenland and at Disco Island, on the western coast of Greenland, to take on additional provisions and to offload 5 men who had been found unfit for the voyage, a routine precaution that reduced the crew to 129. In late July 1845, the crews of 2 whaling ships, the Enterprise and the Prince of Wales, saw the Erebus and Terror moored to an iceberg in Baffin Bay, waiting for favorable ice conditions to allow them to cross into Lancaster Sound. The whaler spoke with the officers, shared a meal, and noted that Franklin and his men seemed in excellent spirits and good health. The whalers sailed on. No European who was not a member of the expedition ever saw any of those 129 men alive again. Part 5. The Silence. 2 years passed, then 3. The expedition had been provisioned for 3 years, and everyone understood that contact during the voyage would be essentially impossible. There was no way to send a letter from the Canadian Arctic in 1845. By 1847, people were beginning to feel uneasy. By 1848, with the 3-year provision estimate exhausted, unease had turned to alarm. It was largely Lady Jane Franklin who turned that alarm into action. Jane was a woman of extraordinary intelligence, determination, and social skill. Jane used every connection she had to push the British Admiralty and the British government to do something about her missing husband. The Admiralty's response was eventually substantial, though it came slowly. Beginning in 1848, a series of search expeditions was launched that grew over the next decade into the largest search and rescue operation in the history of naval exploration. More than 30 separate expeditions, by sea and by land, involving ships from Britain, the United States, and Canada. The scale is difficult to overstate. At the height of the search effort in 1850, There were 11 ships simultaneously combing the Arctic for Franklin's men, approaching from both the eastern and western ends of the passage, while overland parties worked their way down rivers from the south. The Admiralty offered a reward of £20,000, later doubled, to anyone who found Franklin's ship or his men. The reward attracted not just naval officers, but independent adventurers, American whalers, and a wealthy New York merchant named Henry Gennell, who funded 2 American expeditions under Navy Lieutenant Edwin de Haven and later under the physician and explorer Elisha Kane. American ships participated in the search alongside British ones, partly out of genuine humanitarian concern, and partly out of the Arctic mania that had gripped both countries and produced best-selling books, lecture circuits, and public subscription campaigns to fund the search. The Franklin story was the media sensation of the decade in both countries. Newspapers ran regular updates on the search. Painters produced dramatic images of ships locked in ice and men hauling sledges across frozen tundra, and the public followed developments with an attention more typical of a sporting event or a military campaign. Lady Franklin herself became a celebrity, a figure of tragic dignity whose tireless advocacy for her husband transformed her from a naval officer's wife into a national symbol. Lady Jane Franklin's campaign on behalf of the expedition was extraordinary in its persistence and its sophistication. She wrote letters to the President of the United States, to the Tsar of Russia, to heads of state across Europe. She lobbied members of Parliament, cultivated relationships with newspaper editors, and used every social connection she possessed, and she possessed many, to keep the story alive and the pressure on the Admiralty. When the Admiralty dragged its feet or suggested that hope was lost and search efforts should be scaled back, she found private funding and sent her own ships. The American expeditions reflect a genuine transnational humanitarian effort driven partly by public sentiment. Henry Gennell, a wealthy New York shipping merchant, funded 2 American expeditions entirely out of his own pocket. The first, in 1850 to 1851, was commanded by Navy Lieutenant Edwin de Haven and included a young physician named Elisha Kane. The second, in 1853 to 1855, was commanded by Kane himself. Kane's expedition became one of the strangest and most harrowing of all the Franklin searches. His ship became permanently icebound north of Baffin Bay. The men were trapped for 2 winters, and they eventually had to abandon the vessel entirely and walk out across the ice to reach rescue in Greenland, covering hundreds of kilometers on foot in conditions that killed several of them. Kane returned to the United States as a national hero and wrote a best-selling book about his experience, and his celebrity did more than any single publication to sustain American popular interest in the Franklin story throughout the 1850s. Lady Franklin's personal financial contribution to the search was enormous by any standard. She spent what contemporary estimates placed at roughly £35,000 of her own money, a sum that in modern terms represents millions of pounds, on outfitting private search vessels and lobbying for official expeditions. She also accepted donations from the public, from other nations, and from individuals moved by her cause. When the Admiralty finally stopped funding expeditions and officially declared the crew deceased in service, she refused to accept that the story was over, and she was right. The Fox expedition she funded in 1857 to 1859 found the Victory Point note. Without Lady Franklin's refusal to give up, that note might never have been found. Among the figures introduced by the American expeditions, and his story is rather strange. Hall was born around 1821 in New Hampshire, apprenticed as a blacksmith, abandoned that, drifted to Cincinnati, and by the 1850s was running a small newspaper called the Cincinnati Occasional. Somewhere in the middle of publishing local news, he became consumed by the Franklin story. He filled 4 scrapbooks with clippings about the lost expedition and dashed off dozens of letters to Arctic adventurers who occasionally wrote back. He had never sailed on a boat. He had no navigational experience, no survival training, no money, and no obvious reason why the British Admiralty or the American government should take him seriously. He lobbied anyway, writing his own newspaper that a rescue might still be possible and that God had called him to find the missing men. Hall sold his newspaper and headed north in 1860, leaving his wife, who contributed $27 to the expedition, and 2 young children in Cincinnati. His plan was unprecedented. Rather than arriving with ships and provisions and treating the Arctic as something to be conquered, he would simply go and live with the Inuits, learn from them, and trust that their knowledge of the land would get him further than any amount of naval equipment. He convinced himself that more information and perhaps Franklin's survivors would be found among the Inuit natives of the area. He managed to gain passage on a whaling ship, whose captain agreed to drop him off on Baffin Island and pick him up at the end of the whaling season. He arrived with little more than a small boat and basic supplies. It was on Baffin Island that he met Tukulito and Abirbing, who would remain his companions for the rest of his Arctic life. And it was on Baffin Island that something unexpected happened. While searching for traces of Franklin, Hall instead stumbled onto remains of Martin Frobisher's 16th century mining expedition, the camps and relics of the 1576 voyage, nearly 300 years old and preserved in the Arctic cold. He had gone looking for one mystery and found another. He spent 2 years on Baffin Island, learned to live as the Inuits lived, and returned to Cincinnati in 1862 to write a book and raise money for a second attempt. His second expedition from 1864 to 1869 was where the real Franklin work happened. Operating from the northern shore of Hudson Bay and using Inuit guides, he began 5 years and 3,000 miles of journeying by sled, in the course of which he learned much about the fate of Franklin's expedition and found a number of relics. He gathered a testimony that forms one of the most important archives of the expedition's final months, accounts from Inuits who had encountered the survivors, seen the ships, or found the bodies. At one point, despairing of the reliability of some of his hired whalemen, he shot and killed one for threatening a mutiny. He reached King William Island in 1869 and found more skeletal remains and relics. He found no survivors, because there were none to be found. By 1871, Hall had spent the better part of a decade in the Arctic and had become, by any reasonable assessment, the foremost non-Inuit authority on survival in the Canadian North. Congress authorized $50,000 for an expedition to reach the North Pole under his command, and the ship Polaris left New London, Connecticut on July 3, 1871. The expedition's crew included a German physician and scientist named Emil Bessels, with whom Hall almost immediately clashed. The command structure was dysfunctional from the start, with the roles of captain effectively split among 3 men who did not respect each other. That fall, while returning to the ship from a sledging expedition, Hall became ill after drinking a cup of coffee. He experienced severe pain and accused some of the crew members of poisoning him. Bessels, the expedition doctor, attended him at his bedside. Hall refused his care and improved briefly, then deteriorated again when Bessels was permitted to return to him. On November 8, 1871, Hall died. The official verdict was apoplexy, a stroke. Bessels filed the death certificate. The case might have ended there, except that in 1968, a Dartmouth professor named Chauncey Loomis, who was writing a biography of Hall, organized an exhumation of the body from its grave in Greenland. The tests showed that Hall had died of arsenic poisoning. Lethal doses had been administered in the last 2 weeks of his life. Bessels was the prime suspect. He had the means, the access, and the opportunity. Researchers also discover a possible motive. Before the voyage, both Hall and Bessels had become infatuated with a young sculptor in New York named Vennie Ream, and Bessels' feelings for her appeared to have been intense. Whether jealousy, professional antagonism, or something else entirely drove whatever happened on the Polaris. No charges were ever filed. Bessels returned to the United States, gave testimony to a naval board of inquiry that cleared him, continued his scientific career, and died in Stuttgart in 1888. The case has never been resolved. Returning to the Franklin expedition, the first search expedition found nothing. The 1848 expedition under James Clark Ross came closer than Ross ever knew. He entered Lancaster Sound and sent sledge parties south toward Peel Sound, the very route Franklin had taken, but turned back before going far enough to find any sign of the missing ships. He returned to England empty-handed, and the Admiralty prepared another round of expeditions for 1850. One of the 1850 expeditions was commanded by Robert McClure, who approached from the Pacific side of the Arctic in HMS Investigator. McClure did not find Franklin, but he found something that would give the whole Franklin story a peculiar irony. He discovered a northwest passage, a different one from Franklin's route, through the Prince of Wales Strait, and became the first person definitively confirmed that a navigable connection between the Atlantic and Pacific existed, even though his own ship was then stuck in the ice for 3 years, and he and his crew had to be rescued by another ship before they could return home. For a long time, the search expeditions found very little. What they found eventually was the graves. In the summer of 1850, a Scottish whaling captain named William Penny, one of several independent searchers working that season, landed on Beechey Island, a small, flat, desolate island off the southern coast of Devon's Island, in what is now Nunavut, a place of extraordinary bleakness even by the standard of the high Arctic. On Beechey Island, Penny found evidence that the Franklin expedition had wintered there in 1845 to 1846. The remains of a smithy, a carpenter's workshop, the debris of a winter encampment, and more than 700 discarded tin cans, their contents consumed. Footprints were preserved in the Arctic soil, impressions left by men walking to and from the ships in the cold, along with coal dust, rope ends, scraps of clothing, and the fragments of daily life from a ship's crew in a long, dark winter. He also found 3 graves, each marked with a headboard inscribed with the dead man's name, rank, and date of death. John Torrington, petty officer, died January 1, 1846. John Hartnell, able seaman, died January 4, 1846. And William Brain, Royal Marine, died April 3, 1846. 3 men dead in the first 4 months, and the headboards already weathered by the Arctic air. They were the only memorials these men would receive, the only evidence left that they had been there and died there. The discovery of the Beechey Island site was accompanied by a fleet of ships from multiple expeditions, all converging on the same point at the same time. One of those strange moments in the search when everyone arrived together and still found only silence. Captain Horatio Austin's squadron was there. Captain William Penny was there. The American expedition under De Haven was there. They all went ashore and walked among the relics and the graves and felt the weight of the discovery. The American officer Elisha Kane later wrote about the experience in terms that are still moving to read, but no one found a message, no indication of which way the ships had gone after the winter of 1845 to 1846. 3 men dead in the very first winter. It was not a disaster. Expeditions routinely lost men to illness and injuries, but the pattern was troubling, and the discovery of no journals, no notes, no indication of where the ships had gone made the mystery deeper rather than shallower. The expedition had been here, and then it had vanished again. It would be another 9 years before the next significant discovery. Part 6. The Testimony. The crucial breakthrough came not from any of the 30-odd naval expeditions, but from a Scottish explorer working in an entirely different capacity, and his story, and the way it was received, is in some ways the most revealing episode in the entire Franklin saga. John Ray was born in 1813 in Orkney on the northern tip of Scotland, the sixth of 9 children of a man who managed a local estate and served as the Orkney agent for the Hudson's Bay Company. He grew up shooting, sailing, and walking the islands in all weathers. That upbringing gave him physical stamina and a practical relationship with the outdoors that many of his contemporaries simply did not have. He qualified as a physician in Edinburgh in 1833, and that same year signed on as ship surgeon to the Hudson's Bay Company vessel that made the annual voyage to Moose Factory, the trading post on James Bay, in what is now northern Ontario. When the ship's return route was blocked by ice, Ray found himself wintering in Canada, and he made the most of it. He spent the next decade at Moose Factory, working as surgeon and learning everything he could from the Cree Indians and the Métis people who worked in and around the post. He learned to use snowshoes and dog sleds. He learned to read the land for game and the winter for danger. He learned to construct shelter from available materials. By the end of his time at Moose Factory, a colleague described him as the best and a blessed snowshoe walker, not only in the Hudson Bay Territory, but also of the age. The Inuits later gave him the name Agluka, a mark of respect that he had earned, not inherited. What distinguished Ray from the Royal Navy officers who led all the other Franklin search expeditions was not just his physical capability, but his philosophy. The naval approach to Arctic exploration in the Victorian era was fundamentally one of bringing civilization with you. The silver cutlery, the heating systems, the tinned food, the 1,000-volume library. The Inuit method, which worked, was to travel light, live off the land, wear fur, build snow shelters, and know the ice. Ray understood the second method in a way that virtually no European explorers of his generation did. On his first Arctic expedition in 1846 to 1847, he set out with a small party, carried minimal provisions, and planned to hunt for his food, something that would have been unthinkable to an Admiralty-minded commander. He covered enormous distances rapidly, in conditions that would have stopped a heavy naval sledge party in days. By 1854, Ray had already made 4 significant Arctic expeditions on behalf of the Hudson's Bay Company, mapping nearly 1,800 miles of previously uncharted coastline and proving that King William Land was in fact an island, the crucial geographic fact no one had communicated to Franklin before he sailed. Now, in the spring of 1854, he was surveying the Boothia Peninsula, where he encountered a group of Nutsullik Inuits near a place called Pelly Bay, now known as Kulgarak. One man among them was wearing a naval cap band that Ray recognized as British. Ray questioned him through an interpreter. The man told him that several years earlier, about 40 white men had been seen traveling south over the ice, dragging a heavy boat and several sledges. They were thin, exhausted, and seemingly starving. One of the men with them, the Inuit understood through signs, was their leader, a tall man. Ray asked more questions and gathered more testimony from other Inuits in the region over the following weeks. The picture that emerged was grim. The white men had been heading south toward the Back River, also known as the Great Fish River, which flows from the interior of what is now Nunavut to the Arctic coast. they never arrived anywhere. The following spring, Inuit hunting parties had found dozens of bodies scattered across the landscape near the river's mouth, on an island and on the mainland coast. The bodies showed signs of extreme deprivation. The kettles they had been carrying contained evidence of something the Inuit communicated carefully. The men had eaten one another. Ray also collected artifacts from the Inuits, objects they had found with or near the bodies, or had traded with surviving men before their final collapse. Among them were silver forks and spoons, engraved with the crest of the officers. One fork bore the crest of Sir John Franklin himself. Ray reported his findings to the Admiralty in the autumn of 1854, and his report was promptly leaked to the press. The reaction in Britain was extraordinary, and extraordinarily negative. The two things Ray had reported were equally unacceptable to Victorian Britain: that the men had died in such a way that their bodies were found scattered and unburied, and that some of them had resorted to cannibalism. The Royal Navy did not lose its men in this way. Englishmen did not eat each other, and the testimony had come from Inuit sources, from people whom Victorian England regarded at best as primitive and at worst as savages, whose words could not be trusted. The counterattack was coordinated and vicious. Lady Jane Franklin enlisted, among others, Charles Dickens, the most famous writer in England, to publicly discredit both the evidence of cannibalism and the Inuit testimony itself. Dickens wrote a series of articles in his magazine, Household Words, suggesting that it was far more likely the Inuits themselves had killed and mutilated the bodies of Franklin's men than that the men had consumed each other. There was no evidence whatsoever for this assertion. The suggestion was an expression of pure racial prejudice, but in the context of 1854 British public opinion, it was extremely effective. Ray was condemned. His findings were dismissed, discounted, and buried. It would take more than a century of scientific investigation to confirm that Ray was right about everything. Part 7. The Victory Point Note. Lady Franklin refused to accept Ray's account as final. In 1857, having failed to persuade the Admiralty to fund another search, she fitted out a small steam yacht called the Fox at her own expense, and placed it under the command of Francis Leopold McClintock, a naval officer who had participated in 3 previous Arctic search expeditions, and who was both experienced and sympathetic to Lady Franklin's cause. McClintock sailed in July 1857 and spent 2 winters in the Arctic before landing on King William Island in the spring of 1859. What his party found there constituted the most important discovery in the history of the search, not because it revealed everything, but because it was the only written communication from the expedition ever recovered, and because what it said told a story of slow, terrible collapse. The document was found by one of McClintock's officers, Lieutenant William Hobson, tucked into a cairn at a place on the northwestern coast of King William Island, now called Victory Point. It was a standard Admiralty form, a pre-printed sheet designed to be left in cairn or dropped in waterproof containers, so that passing expeditions could leave records of their progress. The form had been used twice, once on May 28, 1847, and again on April 25, 1848. The first entry, written in May 1847, and signed by Lieutenant Graham Gore and Mate Charles DeVoe, was brief and optimistic. It described the ship's route over the past 2 years: winter at Beechy Island in 1845 to 1846, then north through Wellington Channel to latitude 77 degrees north, then south again around the western side of Cornwallis Island, and finally down Peel Sound to the current position, locked in the ice northwest of King William Island. The final 3 words of this first entry were "all is well." The second entry was written almost exactly a year later, in April 1848, in the margins, and on any blank space of the same form. It was a different kind of document entirely, written by Captain James Fitzjames and countersigned by Captain Francis Crozier. The second entry began by noting the expedition's location. The ship had been beset, trapped, in the ice since September 12, 1846. They had been in that ice for 19 months. The crews had spent 2 winters locked in the Victoria Strait northwest of King William Island, unable to move the ships more than a few kilometers from where they had first been stopped by the pack. Then came the numbers. In the first entry, everything had been well. In the second entry, 24 men were already dead, 9 officers and 15 men, out of a complement of 129, had died in less than 2 years, and the most senior man among them had been Sir John Franklin himself, who died on June 11, 1847, just 2 weeks after that optimistic first entry was written. The remaining 105 men, Fitzjames wrote, were abandoning the ships on April 22, 1848, and were intending to march south and west toward the Back River on the Canadian mainland, where they hoped to reach Hudson's Bay Company trading posts and find help. The note was signed. The paper was rolled, placed in a tin cylinder, and left in the cairn. The 105 men walked off the ships and into the Arctic and were never seen alive by any European again. McClintock also found other things on King William Island, and the things he found raised questions that had never been fully resolved. On the south coast of the island, his searching parties came across a human skeleton lying on the ground, still clothed in the remains of a steward's uniform. In the pockets of the clothing were papers, including a seaman's certificate belonging to a chief petty officer named Harry Pegler, who had served on the Terror. For over a century, it was assumed the skeleton was that of Thomas Armitage, a gunroom steward who had been carrying Pegler's certificate after Pegler died. DNA analysis eventually determined it was actually Pegler himself. Among the papers were fragments of a journal written in what appears to be a semi-encoded personal shorthand, with some passages written backwards, the kind of private notation a man uses when he does not expect anyone else to read his writing. The fragments are tantalizing and largely unreadable, the private thoughts of a man approaching death in circumstances we cannot fully imagine. There was also the abandoned ship's boat on its sledge, found partway up the western coast of King William Island. It is the clearest single piece of evidence about the thinking of the men who hauled it there, or the failure of that thinking. The boat was a large ship's whaler mounted on a massive oak sledge, and McClintock estimated the combined weight at about 1,400 pounds. The 2 skeletons inside it had apparently been there for years, and the contents of the boat were extraordinary. Silver plate, a great quantity of clothing, towels, soap, sponges, combs, toothbrushes, a handsaw, files, a thunder powder gun, 2 rolls of sheet lead, a sounding line, religious books including a Bible and a copy of The Vicar of Wakefield, several chocolate bars, and remarkably little food. The men carrying this boat had chosen to drag 1.5 tons of objects across the sea ice rather than leave them behind. Among the objects were 40 pounds of chocolate and negligible quantities of actual food. One of the things that is most striking about the boat's contents is not what is irrational about them, but what might have been rational at the time. The religious books suggest people who expected to die and wanted comfort. The tools suggest people who expected to build something or repair something. The soap and toothbrushes suggest people trying to maintain some thread of civilized identity in conditions that were stripping everything else away. The boat pointed crucially not south toward Back River, but north, back toward the ships. This detail has never been satisfactorily explained. Were the men who died in it part of the group that had turned back, trying to return to the Erebus or the Terror? Was there something on the ships they felt they needed? Nobody knows. McClintock returned to England in the autumn of 1859 with the Victory Point note, the artifacts, in confirmation that the entire expedition had perished. The note itself is an extraordinary object, a standard pre-printed Admiralty form, yellowed and fragile after 11 years in its urn, bearing 2 messages written almost exactly a year apart, with an immeasurable emotional distance between them. Lady Jane Franklin, who received this news at the age of 67, derived from it what comfort she could. The note confirmed that her husband had still been alive, as recently as May 1847, that he had been in command of the expedition for its first crucial year, and that, as she would argue for the rest of her life, the route traced by the Erebus and Terror through the Victoria Strait constituted the discovery of the Northwest Passage. The men had found it, even if they had been unable to navigate it. The credit, she insisted, belonged to her husband. She was not entirely wrong. By any cartographic standard, the route Franklin's ship traveled does represent a navigable Northwest Passage, or at least the passage's existence in that corridor. They had connected the known western end of the Parry Channel system to the known northern coast of the Canadian mainland. John Ray himself acknowledged this in his report. The irony is that the passage Franklin's men found was not usable by the ships of the day. The Victoria Strait was simply too reliably icebound for the technology of 1846, and may have been unusually icebound in that particular era. The Northwest Passage as a practical shipping route would have to wait for both better ships and a warming climate. Roald Edmondson finally navigated the passage successfully between 1903 and 1906 using a much smaller vessel, a 47-ton herring boat, and taking 3 years to do it, wintering twice and traveling at speeds and through depths that no Victorian naval vessel could have matched. He went through the Simpson Strait, slightly south of where Franklin's ships had been trapped, a route so shallow that modern cargo ships still cannot use it. The passage that actually serves shipping today, opened in recent decades by Arctic ice melt, would have been entirely beyond Franklin's reach, even in perfect conditions. Lady Franklin lived until 1875, by which time she was 83 years old, had traveled to virtually every corner of the world, and had received more recognition for her role in promoting Arctic exploration than almost any actual explorer. In 1860, she was awarded the Founder's Gold Medal of the Royal Geographic Society, the first woman ever to receive it, for her support of polar exploration. She never stopped looking for the written record of her husband's expedition, never entirely accepted that the full story was known. She commissioned one final search expedition that set sail on June 1, 1875, only weeks before she died on July 18th of that year. She went to her death, certain that somewhere in the Arctic, something remained to be found. Part 8. The Frozen Franklins. The graves on Beechey Island haunted the people who studied the Franklin expedition for a century after their discovery. 3 men buried in the permafrost, their headboards recording the dates of their deaths, the first to die before whatever catastrophe overtook everyone else. For most of that century, those graves sat undisturbed, the frozen ground preserving its secrets. In the early 1980s, a Canadian anthropologist at the University of Alberta named Owen Beattie began examining bones recovered from King William Island, fragments of skeletons left behind by the men who had walked south from the ships in 1848. He found something disturbing. The bones contained extraordinarily high levels of lead, far higher than would be expected even for a Victorian-era man who had lived in an industrialized city, where lead was ubiquitous in paint, pipe fittings, and everyday material. The levels in the Franklin bones were remarkable, and Beatty began to develop a theory. The source, Beatty suspected, was the canned food, the tin cans sealed with lead solder by Stephen Goldner's workers in 1845, under serious time pressure, given that the contract had been awarded late, would have leached lead into their contents. Soup, meat, vegetables, all slowly contaminated as the tins sat in storage, and as the men ate from them over months and years. The lead accumulated in their bodies, causing effects that ranged from the subtle to the catastrophic: fatigue, cognitive impairment, paranoia, depression, poor judgment, and eventually organ failure. To test his theory, Beatty needed soft tissue rather than bone, tissue that could be analyzed for lead at a cellular level. The only soft tissue that might have survived 140 years was in the graves on Beechey Island. In 1984, Beatty obtained the necessary permissions from the Canadian government and led a small team to Beechey Island. They began with the grave of John Torrington, the first to die. The team spent hours hacking through the frozen gravel, digging down into the permafrost until they reached a depth of about 1.5 meters, where the lid of a mahogany coffin appeared. They lifted the lid and found Torrington encased in a block of ice. They applied heated water to thaw the remains. What emerged was one of the most striking images in the history of polar archaeology. John Torrington, 20 years old, dead since January 1st, 1846, looked as if he had died a few days before. The permafrost had preserved him with extraordinary fidelity. His skin was intact. His eyes, it turned out a light blue, were partially open beneath heavy brown lashes. His dark hair was still on his head. His hands were folded on his chest, his limbs bound with strips of fabric for burial, and he was dressed in a gray cotton shirt with shell buttons and linen trousers. He weighed almost nothing. The cold and the ravages of illness had reduced him to skin and bone before he died, but the permafrost had preserved even that terrible thinness with perfect fidelity. The autopsy revealed that Torrington had died of pneumonia, brought on by tuberculosis. His lungs were severely compromised. His tissue samples, analyzed afterward, showed lead levels far above what would be expected from normal Victorian-era lead exposure. The finding was consistent with Beatty's theory. The canned food, leaching lead into everything the men ate, had slowly poisoned them. Beatty and his team returned to Beechey Island in 1986 to exhume and examine John Hartnell and William Brain. Both had been similarly preserved by the permafrost. Hartnell, in particular, was so well preserved that when the researchers removed his clothing, they could see his abdomen bore the Y-shaped incision of a previous autopsy conducted by the expedition surgeons after his death. Someone on the expedition had already tried to determine why these men were dying. Both Hartnell and Brain also showed evidence of tuberculosis, pneumonia, and elevated lead levels, though somewhat lower than Torrington's. The evidence of poor health was unambiguous. These were not robust men who had been struck down by a single catastrophic event. They were men whose health had been quietly undermined over months. There is something haunting about Hartnell's internal autopsy scar in particular, beyond its immediate implication that the expedition's surgeons tried to investigate the cause of death. It means that somewhere in the winter of 1845 to 1846, on a ship frozen into the ice of a harbor on Beechey Island, a Royal Navy surgeon opened a dead man's chest and examined his organs looking for answers the ship could not yet know it needed. The surgeon found something, enough to make them worry perhaps, or not enough to warn them adequately. Their report, whatever it contained, has never been found. It is also worth noting that Beechey Island's small cemetery includes a fourth occupant who was not part of the Franklin expedition at all. Thomas Morgan, a sailor who died in 1854, was a member of one of the search expeditions that came looking for Franklin's men. He was buried in the same small plot, and his grave marker stands alongside the 3 Franklin graves, an accidental memorial to the fact that the search for the expedition also cost lives. The graves as they stand today, 4 headboards in the Arctic gravel, with the Franklin men now replaced by bronze plaque, and the ground beneath them littered with the rusted remains of cans the expedition left in 1846, make a strangely intimate place, a small human monument in an enormous and indifferent landscape. Beatty's findings, published in the 1987 book Frozen in Time, co-written with journalist John Geiger, became a popular sensation and shifted the dominant theory of why the Franklin expedition failed. The book contained photographs of the exhumations, including the face of John Torrington, and those photographs achieved a strange cultural resonance that went far beyond the usual readership of polar history. Torrington's preserved blue eyes and dark lashes, staring up from below, were published in newspapers and magazines around the world, and the image became one of the most recognizable faces in the history of forensic archaeology. A 20-year-old sailor who had been dead for 140 years, looking as though he had simply closed his eyes for a moment. Lead poisoning from tinned food had compromised the mental and physical faculties of the men, turning what might have been a difficult but manageable situation into an uncontrolled disaster. Impaired judgment, impaired coordination, impaired decision-making, all of these could have contributed to a series of choices that accelerated the men's deaths. The lead poisoning theory is compelling and is still widely accepted in its broad outlines, but science has continued to complicate the picture. More recent analysis using high-resolution imaging techniques not available to Beatty in the 1980s has suggested that the lead distribution in bones of the Beechey Island men is consistent with exposure that preceded the expedition. That is, they may have arrived already significantly lead exposed from a lifetime in a lead-saturated Victorian industrial environment, where lead appears in paint, water pipes, glazed pottery, and a dozen other everyday sources. This does not mean the canned food was safe. It means the situation is more complex than a simple poisoned tin killed everyone. The debate over the precise role of lead in the expedition's failure continues in the scientific literature, and the question may never be fully answered. Part 9. The Slow Walk South. These were not unprepared men who wandered into the Arctic without a plan. They had 3 years of food. They had 2 of the most robust ships ever sent north. They had surgeons, experienced ice masters, officers who had been to both poles. They had steam engines powerful enough to push through pack ice. By every measure available to the British Admiralty in 1845, the expedition was over-prepared. And yet, within 3 years, every single one of them was gone. The mystery deepens when you consider what the surviving evidence does and does not tell us. We have the Victory Point Note, written in April 1848, which tells us the ships were beset in September 1846, that 24 men were dead by April 1848, that Franklin himself had died that previous June, and that the remaining 105 were about to march south, and then silence. No journals were ever found, no letters, no distress signals, because there was no way to send one. The men simply walked off. The march south itself raises questions that have never been satisfactorily resolved. The route they chose, south along the coast of King William Island toward Back River, was logical in theory. The Back River leads to Hudson Bay's Company territory, which means food and help. but the mouth of that river was 400 kilometers away across sea ice in open tundra, and the river itself is a long, difficult descent through rapids and portages that tested experienced canoeists in the summer. These men were not canoeists, they were sailors, already weakened after 19 months locked in the ice, dragging boats so heavy that healthy men would have struggled to move them. Even if everything had gone perfectly from the moment they stepped off the ship, the march would have been extraordinarily difficult. What puzzles historians most is the speed of the collapse. 24 men dead in under 2 years, before the march even began, on a ship full of food, with 2 surgeons on board. That death rate is far higher than any comparable expedition of the period. Something was wrong well before April 1848. Something that the Victory Point Note, in its terse accounting of deaths and its brisk announcement of the plan to march south, does not explain. And because no one survived to explain it, we are left with the bones, the relics, the Inuit testimony, and the painstaking work of forensic scientists who have spent decades trying to read the evidence the ice preserved. Here is our best reconstruction of what happened. The expedition arrived in the Arctic in the summer of 1845 in good health and good spirits. They wintered at Beechey Island in 1845 to 1846, spending the long polar nights on the ships, which were frozen into the harbor ice. 3 men died that winter. In the summer of 1846, when the ice broke up enough to allow navigation, the expedition moved south toward Peel Sound, passing the western coast of Somerset Island, and entered the Victoria Strait north of King William Island. This was the uncharted territory, the last blank space on the map. And then, in September 1846, the ice closed around them and did not let go. The pack ice of Victoria Strait is notoriously unstable and dangerous. It is not seasonal ice that forms in winter and melts in summer. It is multi-year ice, thick and old, pushed by currents and winds into grinding, churning mass that can trap a ship and hold it for years. The Erebus and Terror were caught in this ice northwest of King William Island and held there through the winter of 1846 to 1847. When summer came in 1847, the ice still did not release them, and they remained trapped through yet another winter. During this time, men were dying. We know the death toll and its breakdown from a single source, the Victory Point Note, the document McClintock found in 1859. According to that note, by April 1848, 24 men were dead, and 9 of them were officers, a disproportionate share given that officers were a minority of the crew. The note does not explain the disproportion. The leading hypothesis is that officers, eating more of the expedition's canned provisions as a matter of social custom, accumulated more lead from the soldiers' tin than the ordinary seamen who supplemented their diet differently. Another possibility is scurvy, advancing faster in older men. Another is simply that the officers were recording the deaths and may have attributed some ambiguous cases to the officers' column out of professional habit. And among the dead was John Franklin, who died on June 11, 1847, at 61 years of age. We know this date only because Fitzjames recorded it on the Victory Point Note. The precise cause of death is not recorded anywhere. His body has never been found. Command passed to Francis Crozier, capable, experienced, a man who had sailed to both poles and knew the Arctic as well as any living Briton, and who now had to decide what to do with 105 increasingly ill and depleted men. 2 ships locked in ice they could not navigate, and a dwindling food supply that the cold had preserved, but that may have been quietly poisoning them for nearly 3 years. Crozier decided to abandon the ships and march south. The ships, though icebound, were a shelter. They were warm, or relatively warm. The steam heating systems were presumably still operational. drawing on the coal stores to maintain some habitable temperature below deck. They held whatever food remained. The men were ill, malnourished, and in no condition for a 400-kilometer march across some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. The nearest Hudson's Bay Company post, Fort Resolution at Great Slave Lake, was more than 1,000 kilometers away by river. The nearest point of probable relief was the Back River mouth, itself a 400-kilometer march over sea ice and tundra, with a river journey of several hundred more kilometers beyond that. Crozier was not unaware of the distance. He had been to the Arctic before. He knew what the Back River was, and knew that descending it in spring, in the condition his men were in, was a desperate undertaking. But 2 more winters on icebound ships, if they even survived that long, if the ice didn't crush the hull, might simply kill everyone without giving them any chance at all. At least on the march, there was a destination, a direction, the possibility of rescue or game, or Inuit who might help. He made the only decision that seemed to offer any hope of survival. The men began the enormous logistical task of offloading equipment from the ships, food, boats, sledges, tools, weapons, navigational instruments, and dragging it across the ice to the shore of King William Island. It took days. We know the weight of what they brought because one of the expedition's lifeboats was later found by McClintock's party on its sledge in 1859, and the combined weight of boat, sledge, and contents was close to a ton. The men who dragged it were malnourished, probably suffering lead exposure, and almost certainly dealing with early scurvy. To drag a ton-weight sledge over rough Arctic sea ice is an act of almost superhuman effort, even for healthy men. For these men, it must have been agonizing. The 105 men dragged the ship's boat on sledges across the sea ice to the northwestern coast of King William Island and established a camp there, later called Crozier's Landing, the point from which they began the march south. The Victory Point node was left in its cairn. What happened next is a story told in fragments, bones, abandoned equipment, and the testimony of Inuits who watched it happen. The sled contents we know from McClintock's 1859 discovery. He found silver cutlery, curtain rods, lightning conductors, a prayer book, and a copy of Oliver Goldsmith's collected works among the abandoned equipment. Objects so impractical for a survival march that historians have wondered for 160 years whether the men were thinking clearly when they packed them. That may be evidence of lead poisoning and its cognitive effects, or of the particular irrationality of extreme exhaustion, where the familiar and the symbolic become substitute for the practical. What the men looked like on the march, how they behaved, comes almost entirely from Inuit testimonies collected by Charles Francis Hall in the 1860s. Those accounts describe men who were exhausted and visibly sick, who communicated by signs because no one on either side spoke the other's language, who were in obvious, desperate condition. One group of Inuit Hall spoke with had been unable to help the white men because they themselves had little food. The land in spring could support a small mobile community that knew it intimately, but not 105 sick and heavily burdened strangers. Another group had watched the men drag their heavy sledges south and turn a corner and not come back. The Inuit oral histories collected by Hall and later by Franz Boas and others contain the kind of specific sensory detail, the way men's breath steamed, the sound of their boots on the ice, the way one man pointed south and another pointed at his stomach, that speaks to the precision of an observational tradition that preserved exactly what it had seen. These are not vague accounts of white men in trouble. They are eyewitness descriptions, passed down carefully, of specific people in specific places doing specific things. Researchers who have mapped the locations described in Inuit testimony against the locations where physical evidence was later found have consistently found them to match. The last of the 105 men died somewhere south of King William Island, probably in the vicinity of the Back River mouth, in 1848 or possibly later. The forensic evidence, which we will come to shortly, suggests the deaths were more staggered than any single timeline implies. Not one of them reached safety. Not one survivor ever sent word back to England. The southernmost point at which definitive physical evidence of the expedition was found is Starvation Cove on the Adelaide Peninsula, named by Frederick Schwatka, a United States Army lieutenant who led the last major 19th century Franklin search expedition from 1878 to 1880. Schwatka's party, guided throughout by Inuit, including Ipervik, who had worked with Hall, documented dozens of human remains across King William Island in the Adelaide Peninsula over 11 months and more than 4,300 kilometers of travel. At Starvation Cove, they found a cluster of skeletons around a wrecked ship's boat. The last group of men, the ones who had made it furthest south. Inuit interviewed by Schwatka described what the site had looked like when they first found it years earlier. Papers scattered on the ground, knives and forks and spoons and cans, and a boat that had subsequently been broken up and taken away. The Inuits had taken the useful things. The documents were gone. The men who had owned everything there had been dead for 3 decades. Whether Crozier was among the last to go or died early in the march is unknown. Inuit accounts collected by both Hall and Schwatka described a man matching Crozier's general description. Large, with some distinguishing characteristic, seen traveling south and east, and possibly encountered near the Baker Lake area, some 400 kilometers from King William Island, in the early 1850s. If those accounts describe Crozier, he outlasted most of the others by years. His body has never been found. He is, like Franklin, a man who walked off the edge of the documentary record in April 1848 and has not been accounted for since. Part 10. The Bones. The bones of the Franklin expedition men have been the subject of intense scientific study since the 1980s, and they have told a story that is both grimly specific and frustratingly incomplete. The most important physical evidence came from King William Island, where search parties beginning with McClintock in 1859 and continuing through to the present day have found scattered human remains. The bones are not all together. They are distributed across the island's western and southern coasts, and along the route, the men appear to have taken south. Some are in what appear to have been temporary burial sites. Others are simply lying where they fell, or were scattered by animals or weather over the 170 years since the men died. In the 1990s, Canadian anthropologist Anne Kinglyside studied a collection of Franklin's expedition bones and found cut marks, the precise, deliberate marks left by metal tools working on bone, in locations consistent with the butchering of human body for food. These were not marks left by animals scavenging the remains. They were marks left by other people. This confirmed what John Ray had been told in 1854, what he had reported to the Admiralty, and what had been dismissed, condemned, and vilified for 140 years. The men of the Franklin expedition, in their final desperate weeks or months, had eaten one another. It was not a choice in any meaningful sense of the word. It was what happened to people who were starving to death, who had watched their companions die one by one, and who had no other source of calories in a landscape that had nothing to offer them in early spring. Then, in 2015, Historic England re-examined 35 bones from the Franklin expedition, using more sophisticated imaging techniques. They found not just cut marks, but something even more harrowing. Evidence of what researchers call pot polish. Some of the bones showed the distinctive sheen that comes from being boiled in water. the collagen in the bone surface modified by sustained heat, and the men had not just cut flesh from the bones of the dead, but had put them in kettles and boiled them to extract the marrow. This is what scientists term end-stage cannibalism, the complete processing of a body for every possible caloric resource, carried out by people so desperate that they were scraping the inside of the pot. John Ray had described kettles that showed evidence of their contents. The Victorian public had howled with outrage. The bones said he was right. Beyond the cannibalism, the bones have also provided other information. Evidence of scurvy is present in some of the remains, suggesting that the men's diets had been inadequate well before the final march. Scurvy is caused by vitamin C deficiency, and identifiable in bone through specific structural changes. Evidence of general nutritional deficiency is widespread. Some researchers have argued that zinc deficiency, also caused by inadequate diet, may have accelerated the growth of tuberculosis bacteria in the men's lungs, explaining the high early mortality from respiratory illness. Botulism is potentially fatal bacterial infection, has been proposed as another factor. Improperly sealed canned food can develop botulism toxin, and Goldner's hurriedly produced tins were not beyond suspicion in this regard. One of the more recent and remarkable developments in the forensic study of the expedition came in 2024, when researchers announced that they had positively identified the skeletal remains of James Fitzjames, the Erebus's captain, and one of the two men who signed the Victory Point note, using DNA analysis and genealogical research. The remains had been found in 1993 in the vicinity of Erebus Bay on King William Island, about 80 kilometers from where the ships had been abandoned. Fitzjames died somewhere in May 1848, shortly after co-signing the note. He was 34 years old. The identification confirmed that he had made it off the ships with the main group, walked south with the survivors, and died roughly 80 kilometers into the march that the strongest of them could not complete. The identification of Fitzjames also confirmed details about his illegitimate birth that researchers had long suspected but could not prove through documentary evidence alone. The DNA linked him to descendants of the Gambier family that genealogical research had pointed toward, closing a biographical mystery that had been open for nearly 2 centuries. He died in the Arctic, without his true parentage ever having been publicly acknowledged, and was buried, insofar as scattered bones on a gravel beach constituted burial, without his name being properly known. The truth seems to be that there was no single cause of the expedition's collapse. The men were killed by an accumulation of problems that reinforced each other. An unusually severe ice year that held the ships for 19 months when 2 seasons of clear navigation might have saved them. Nutritional deficiencies from 3 winters of preserved food without fresh fruit, vegetables, or meat. Lead exposure from the tinned provisions, tuberculosis and other respiratory illness, and men whose immune systems were already compromised. Scurvy developing as the lemon juice supplies lost its potency. And the cold, draining the energy and warmth from bodies that had no reserves left to draw on. Each problem made the others worse. The men deteriorated, and the speed of their deterioration outran their ability to adapt or recover. What began as a well-equipped expedition of 129 healthy men ended with bones scattered across an Arctic shore in a place named Starvation Cove. Part 11. The Fringe, the Possible, and the Unknown. Every mystery as rich as the Franklin expedition attracts theories, and not all of them fit comfortably in the mainstream of academic consensus. The Franklin story has accumulated alternative interpretations across nearly 2 centuries, some from reputable scholars using rigorous methods, some from enthusiastic amateurs. The most consequential alternative theory, and in some ways the least acknowledged in popular accounts, is the map theory. The idea that Franklin's ship entered the wrong channel because the maps they were carrying were wrong, and that a different choice at a single navigational fork might have saved them all. When Franklin's ship descended from Beechey Island in the summer of 1846, they moved south and west, entering the channel to the west of King William Island. The maps they were working from, based on James Clark Ross's Overland Survey of 1830, showed King William Island not as an island at all, but as a peninsula connected to the Boothia Peninsula to the east by an unbroken stretch of land. This was a surveying error, but a consequential one. If King William Island is a peninsula rather than an island, there is no eastern coastal channel to attempt. You can only go west. So Franklin went west into the Victoria Strait, which is choked with multi-year packed ice that very rarely clears, and the ships were trapped. What the maps couldn't show because no one had yet surveyed it, and the supposedly solid land connection to the east turned out to be water, was that the eastern side of King William Island faces a relatively navigable channel, now known as the James Ross Strait. This is the route Roald Amundsen took in 1903 to 1906 in his successful transit of the Northwest Passage. Amundsen's vessel, a small, shallow drafted herring boat, went east of King William Island through water that, while still requiring careful navigation, is far less reliably blocked by permanent pack ice than the Victoria Strait to the west. Had Franklin's maps shown that an eastern passage existed, had he known that King William Island was an island, he might have tried that route, found it navigable, and sailed into history as the discoverer of the Northwest Passage, rather than its most famous casualty. This theory is the mainstream explanation for why the ships ended up where they did. What makes it feel theoretical is its counterfactual quality. We cannot know what Franklin would have done with accurate maps, only what he did with inaccurate ones. One dissenting voice before the expedition departed was Dr. Richard King, a naturalist who had traveled the Back River to the Arctic coast in the 1830s, who wrote to the Admiralty urging that Franklin's heavy ships were the wrong tool for the job, that a small overland party would be far more effective, and that the western approach to King William Island was a trap. King was largely dismissed because he was not a naval officer, and the Admiralty did not appreciate civilian advice. Every word he wrote turned out to be correct. A very different kind of challenge to the conventional story comes from Professor Andrew Lambert of King's College London, who argues in his 2009 biography of Franklin that the Northwest Passage narrative was essentially a story Lady Jane Franklin and the British public imposed on the expedition after the fact. The real mission, Lambert contends, was magnetic science. By the 1840s, experienced Arctic navigators, including Franklin himself, knew perfectly well that the Northwest Passage, even if found, was useless for commercial shipping. The ice, the shallow channels, the seasonal navigational window were all too limiting. No merchant ship was going to use it. What remained scientifically and strategically valuable was the magnetic data. The 1840s were a period of intense international interest in the Earth's magnetic field. Alexander von Humboldt had proposed that a global network of magnetic observatories could eventually produce a predictive navigational tool, a way for ships to determine their position from magnetic readings as reliably as from celestial observations. Franklin's expedition carried sophisticated magnetic instruments and was tasked with taking systematic readings throughout the voyage. The magnetic North Pole was located by Ross in 1831. It was mobile, and tracking its movement required ongoing observation from multiple locations. Lambert argues that this was the expedition's true purpose, and that the passage narrative, which Franklin himself would have known was largely symbolic, was a wrapper in which the magnetic science was sold to Parliament and the public. This reading doesn't change what happened. The ships went where they went and the ice trapped them, but it reframes why they were there, and it explains why Crozier and other experienced officers were chosen partly for their magnetic observation skills, rather than for general Arctic competence alone. The darkest set of theories concerns what happened after the ships were abandoned, questions of social breakdown, fragmentation of command, and possibly mutiny. The standard narrative of the march south treats it as an organized, if desperate, retreat. 105 men walking under Crozier's command toward the back river with a coherent plan. But some researchers, drawing on Inuit testimony and physical distribution of the remains found on King William Island, have proposed that the march was less organized than this picture suggests. Some Inuit accounts describe groups of men moving separately, not together. Others describe interactions in which the men appear to have no single leader, or to be arguing among themselves. The physical evidence, bodies, and equipment scattered across a wide area, not concentrated along a single route, is consistent with the group fragmenting into smaller parties that moved differently and died in different places. One theory which has been given serious consideration, though not consensus, is that there was a mutiny or, at minimum, a breakdown of the command structure on the march, with some men refusing to follow Crozier's lead and splitting off in different directions. The argument runs that Crozier repeatedly passed over for senior command, despite enormous experience, twice refused in his marriage proposal to Sophia Cracroft, Franklin's own niece, openly reluctant to lead the expedition, and now in command of a disaster he had not created, may not have been in a position to maintain authority over 100 dying, frightened men with no food and no realistic hope of rescue. Crozier had met Sophia in Van Diemen's Land in 1840, when Franklin was governor and Sophia was living with the Franklins as Lady Jane's companion. He fell in love with her and proposed. She declined. He returned to England, went to Antarctica with James Clark Ross, came back in 1843 and proposed again. She declined again. He spent a year in Italy recovering, then was recruited for the 1845 expedition. He was 50 years old, by his own account, heartbroken, and openly unenthusiastic about another Arctic voyage. The letters he wrote before departure read like the correspondence of a man who went because he had nothing better to do, and because the alternative was staying in the same social world where he had twice been refused. None of this makes him incompetent. By all accounts, he was a first-rate officer. But it does suggest that the human picture of the expedition's final months was more complicated than a straightforward story of professional men in a professional crisis. These were people with backstories and griefs and relationships, carrying all of that into conditions that stripped away every comfort and every distraction. The Woodman narrative represents perhaps the most sustained scholarly attempt to reconstruct what happened after the Victory Point Note was written, and it arrives at conclusions very different from the standard account. David Woodman, working through the Inuit testimony systematically in the 1990s, argued that most of the 105 men who left the ships did not die quickly. The Inuit accounts he examined describe men alive in the area of King William Island in the northern mainland coast for years after April 1848, encounters in 1849, 1850, possibly as late as 1851. In Woodman's reconstruction, many of the men returned to one of the ships, most likely the Terror, after the initial march south made it clear they could not reach the back river, and managed to navigate it some distance south before the ship either sank or was again beset by ice. Woodman's two books, Unraveling the Franklin Mystery and Strangers Among Us, make the case that the standard account, which imagines all 105 men dying in a single southward march in 1848, is inconsistent with the weight of Inuit testimony that a more drawn-out complex sequence of events better fits the evidence. This framework also gained support from the location of the Terror when it was found in 2016. The ship lies in Terror Bay, south of where it was reportedly abandoned, buttoned down tight, as one researcher described it, with hatches closed, propeller in the operating position, and the interior suggesting organized departure rather than catastrophic abandonment. If the ship drifted there passively from the abandonment point, the required current and ice conditions are difficult to account for. If men sailed it there deliberately, using the steam engine, that points to a different story entirely, and one that the Inuit testimony Woodman compiled supports. The question of whether any of the 105 men survived beyond the summer of 1848 deserves far more serious attention than the standard account typically gives it. The conventional picture, 105 men walking south in April 1848, all of them dead by winter, is the simplest reading of the evidence, but the evidence does not actually support so clean a timeline. The most significant specific testimony comes from Charles Francis Hall's interviews in the 1860s with Inuits who had direct knowledge of the aftermath. One account, collected carefully by Hall and considered by Woodman to be among the most reliable in the entire archive, describes 4 white men seen alive and traveling south as late as 1851, 3 years after the ships were abandoned. This is generally cited as the last verified sighting of any possible survivor of the expedition, and even this has been treated with some skepticism by historians who prefer a simpler endpoint. But there is no obvious reason to dismiss it. The Inuit who reported it were describing something they had seen, not something they had heard secondhand. Supporting the idea of a longer survival timeline is the physical evidence at Montreal Island, at the mouth of Back River where it meets Chantry Inlet, found during the 1855 expedition of James Anderson and James Stewart. Anderson and Stewart traveled north by canoe from the Hudson's Bay Company's territory specifically to follow up on Ray's report, and what they found on Montreal Island is striking. They recovered wood chips and shavings, ends of planks in pine, elm, ash, oak, and mahogany, the specific materials used in Franklin's ship's boats, along with carpenter's tools, including a broken saw. One piece of wood was inscribed with the name Erebus. Another was marked Mr. Stanley, the surname of the Erebus's surgeon. On their journey, Inuits told them of a group of white men who had starved to death along the coast, and described articles from the ships that they had collected or seen. The inscription on the wood proved conclusively that at least some of the men had reached the mouth of the Back River. The carpenter's tool and the wood shavings have been interpreted by some researchers as evidence that survivors actually attempted to build a canoe from the wreckage of their boat, intending to navigate the river inland toward help. If that interpretation is correct, it suggests not the passive collapse of starving men, but an active, rational attempt at survival at the very southern limit of where the march could reach. Even more intriguing is an account gathered by later researchers about an elderly Inuit man named Puturak, who stated that in the early 1850s, he had boarded a large ship frozen in the ice south of King William Island and found inside it the body of a dead white man lying in a bunk. He was specific about the location. When researchers mapped what he described against the geography of the area, the spot he indicated corresponds closely to where the Erebus was eventually found in 2014. Puturak's account had been recorded decades before the wreck's discovery, and its geographical precision, pointing to a location that no one had any particular reason to name until a sonar image appeared on a laptop screen, and a Parks Canada research vessel, is one of the more arresting pieces of evidence in the entire history of the search. What Bertorak's account implies is equally important. If the Erebus still had a dead man in the bunk in the early 1850s, it had not been abandoned in the chaotic way one might expect if all hands had simply walked off the ship into the ice. Someone had been on that ship after April 1848, either because they never left or because they returned to it. They had died in their bunk, in relative order, their body remaining undisturbed long enough for an Inuit hunter boarding an ice-locked ship in the early 1850s to find them. There is also the matter of the Adam Beck testimony from 1850, which is less reliable. Adam Beck was a Greenlander who served as an interpreter for Captain Aramis O'Mahony's search expedition aboard HMS Lady Franklin that year. Beck claimed that Inuits had told him of a massacre, that Franklin's men had been killed by other Inuits, not died of starvation. His account caused significant alarm and briefly delayed the expedition before it was discredited. The Inuit he claimed to have spoken with were tracked down and denied saying any such thing, and Beck's own credibility was questioned. Most historians dismissed the Beck account entirely, but the episode illustrates how information was being generated, how difficult interpretation was across multiple language barriers, and how easily testimony could be distorted, embellished, or invented in the charged atmosphere of the search. The forensic evidence from the bones themselves already resists a tidy 1848 death date. Schwatka's 1879 expedition found remains at multiple locations across King William Island and the Adelaide Peninsula, and the distribution of those remains, scattered over a wide geographical location in sites that suggest very different circumstances of death, is not consistent with a single group dying together in a single session. Some men clearly died early in the march. Some died much later and much further south. The range of locations where remains have been found, from the northwestern coast of King William Island all the way to Starvation Cove on the Adelaide Peninsula mainland, spans a distance of well over 200 kilometers. Even moving slowly, some men were clearly still walking when others had already been dead for months. None of this proves that anyone survived long enough to have been rescued, or that any of the 105 men lived to see 1850, let alone 1851. It does mean that the story did not end in a single day in 1848, when 105 men lay down in the snow simultaneously. It unfolded over time, with some men lasting longer than others, some making rational decisions in desperate circumstances, some possibly returning to the ships, some possibly reaching the back river and attempting to navigate it. How long any of them held on is one of the questions the Arctic has not yet fully answered. Then there is the question of what happened to Crozier himself. Sophia Cracroft, in a letter written in the early 1860s, described receiving information from Charles Francis Hall's Arctic work suggesting that Crozier and 2 crew members had been seen alive around 1850 or 1851, roughly 400 kilometers south of King William Island near what is now Baker Lake. Hall was apparently convinced, perhaps too convinced, that Crozier might still be alive. He was not, by any reasonable probability, still alive by the 1860s, but the reports of his survival into the early 1850s, filtered through Inuit oral tradition and translated by Hall's interpreters, have never been fully dismissed. If Crozier survived longer than the other men, if he made it further south, if he spent time among Inuit communities before finally succumbing, there might be a story there that has not yet been fully told. One theory that touches the biographical and nearly tips into legend holds that Crozier survived for years in the company of Inuit communities, learned the language and the ways of living on the land, and ultimately died among them, so integrated into the community that no record identifiable as distinctly European was ever found. This would explain why no European searchers ever found his body or clear trace of him south of King William Island, and it is consistent with some Inuit accounts of a white man who traveled with Inuit parties and seemed to understand the land. It cannot be proven, but neither can it be dismissed. Lady Jane Franklin's desperation to locate her husband also led her, privately, to consult spiritualists and clairvoyants, a practice that was, in the 1840s and 1850s, less outlandish in polite society than it might appear today. In November 1849, Lady Jane and Sophia Cracroft consulted a London clairvoyant named Ellen Dawson to try and obtain visions of the missing expedition. Sophia recorded the session in writing, asking specifically about the other ship and its captain, the Terror and Francis Crozier. The clairvoyant provided visions that were predictably both vivid and useless as navigational information. But the fact that Lady Franklin, one of the most practically effective and politically sophisticated women of her age, was sitting in a parlor asking mediums about her husband's location, speaks to the extraordinary suffering that the uncertainty caused, and to the degree to which the Franklin mystery penetrated into every corner of Victorian emotional life. Why so many more officers died than ordinary seamen by April 1848, a ratio of 37% to 14%, has never been fully resolved, though the various hypotheses about differential canned food consumption point in a consistent direction. Where John Franklin is buried remains completely unknown. His body was not among the remains found on King William Island or along the Southern March route. If he died on the Erebus in June 1847, he was presumably buried by his shipmates in some ceremony appropriate to a naval officer of his rank. But where exactly, under what conditions, and whether the grave is still findable are open questions. Some researchers believe he was interred in the Erebus itself, and that when divers eventually penetrate the most interior spaces of the wreck, they may find something, a coffin, remains, a marker of some kind. Perhaps the most haunting of all the open threads is the question of the expedition's written record. A naval expedition of this size and importance would have kept extensive documentation, captain's logs, officers' personal journals, ship's logs, naturalists' observations, meteorological record, magnetic observation data. None of it has ever been recovered. James Fitzjames' personal journal, begun on the voyage out from England in lively and readable prose, has been missing for nearly 180 years. The logbooks of both the Erebus and the Terror, the charts the ice masters used, the records that would tell us what those 2 winters locked in the ice were actually like, are simply gone. The possibility that some of these documents remain preserved in the cold, dark interior of the Erebus or the Terror is not as remote as it might seem. The wrecks are in water cold enough to preserve organic material. The interiors of the ship, sealed from the outside environment, would be in a state of near stasis, no light, no air circulation, no significant variation in temperature. A document preserved in a tin box in a sealed officer's cabin has not been exposed to the elements in 180 years. Papers in those conditions can survive. Ink can survive. If the structural collapse of the ships in their sinking did not destroy the contents of the cabins, and from what the underwater archaeologists have seen of the Terror, where the internal structures appear largely intact, then there is a real possibility that written records exist somewhere in those wrecks, waiting. This is the thing that keeps people going back, not just the mystery of what happened, the mystery of what could still be found. The wrecks of the Erebus and the Terror, found in 2014 and 2016 respectively, are the most significant development in Franklin research since the exhumations on Beechey Island. The Erebus was found in September 2014 by a Parks Canada team using side-scan sonar in Wilmot in Crampton Bay, off the eastern coast of Queen Maud Gulf, lying in about 11 meters of water in relatively good condition, identifiable by the distinctive profile of its hull and the deck furnitures visible even through the murk of the Arctic water. The confirmation came when divers went down and found objects that had been listed on the ship's manifest, and eventually a bronze bell. The Terror was found in September 2016 by the Arctic Research Foundation vessel Martin Bergman, which had made a detour to Terror Bay after one crew member, an Inuit named Sami Kogvik, mentioned a recollection. Years earlier, he had seen what he thought was a large wooden mass or spar sticking out of the ice in Terror Bay, and had photographed it, and had always wondered what it was. On the basis of that memory, exactly the kind of Inuit oral and personal knowledge that the search team had learned to take seriously, the Martin Bergman went and looked. On September 3rd, 2016, they found the Terror. The ship was lying at about 24 meters of depth, sitting essentially level on the seafloor, in what archaeologists described as pristine condition. The ROV footage shot in 2018 during the first systematic interior exploration of the Terror shows something that is genuinely startling, even for people who have spent years thinking about this wreck. The mess hall is intact, the long tables where the lower deck crew ate their meals, the shelving along the walls, plates sitting on those shelves as if waiting for the next meal. Bottles are upright in the wine storage area. An open desk drawer gaped slightly, as if someone was just looking for something and pushed it back carelessly. The forward hatch is closed and latched. The windows are unbroken. The glass of one porthole has a thin film of sediment on it, but is otherwise clear. The lead archaeologist, Ryan Harris, described the feeling of seeing this footage as difficult to articulate. A 170-year-old ship that looked, in certain frames, as if people had just left it. You look at it and find it hard to believe this is a 170-year-old shipwreck, he said. You just don't see this kind of thing very often. The discovery of the Terror fundamentally changes the archaeology of the Franklin expedition, because unlike the Erebus, which has been partially collapsed by ice pressure and is in shallower, more difficult to work water, the Terror appears to be largely intact at a depth and in a location that makes systematic archaeological exploration possible. If Franklin's journals are anywhere, they are most likely in the officers' cabins of one of those two ships. If the last chapter of the story can be found in documentary form, it is most likely in the dark interior of the Terror, waiting in the cold. The challenge is formidable. Diving in the Arctic is possible for only a few weeks each year, when the sea ice retreats enough to allow ships to reach the site. The water is cold enough to kill a diver in minutes without proper equipment. The wrecks are fragile. Every penetration risks disturbing the structure. The ongoing archaeological work, led by Parks Canada in collaboration with Inuit communities, who have co-ownership rights over the wreck and their contents under agreement negotiated with the federal government, a recognition of the long-standing relationship between Inuit knowledge and the search, is slow, careful, and methodical. Artifacts that are recovered have to be treated with extraordinary care, since objects that have been preserved by cold salt water for 180 years will deteriorate rapidly if exposed to air and warmth without proper conservation treatment. Each object recovered goes through a lengthy process of stabilization, documentation, and analysis before it can even be displayed. It may be decades before the interior of the ships are fully documented. But the work is happening, year by year, dive by dive, in brief Arctic summers when the ice allows it. Conclusion. The Franklin expedition ended with 129 men dead, 2 ships lost, and a mystery that occupied the imagination of the English-speaking world for 170 years. It produced more than 30 search expeditions that collectively mapped enormous stretches of the Canadian Arctic, which is one of the expedition's stranger legacies. The disaster and the search for it accomplished more geographical work than any single mission could have done intentionally. The search expedition discovered Lancaster Sound's full extent, mapped the coasts of dozens of Arctic islands, and ultimately traced the complete route of several potential Northwest passages, even though they never found the men they were looking for. The expedition also spawned multiple literature, novels, poems, paintings, songs, operas, television series, and films. Alfred Lord Tennyson, who was Franklin's nephew by marriage, wrote poetry animated by the story of the lost expedition, the meditation on the sea, on passing into the unknown, on the nature of heroic death that marks some of his later work. Joseph Conrad invoked the Erebus and Terror in the opening pages of Heart of Darkness as embodiments of the spirit of British exploration, the great ships as knight-errants of the sea, gone into the dark without return. Charlotte Bronte, in Letters to a Friend, described herself following the search expeditions in the newspapers with anxious attention, caught up in the narrative the way audiences today are caught up in a serial drama. Lady Jane Franklin's campaign to establish her husband's reputation as the discoverer of the Northwest Passage was ultimately successful. A monument for Franklin was erected in London's Waterloo Place, and another in his birthplace of Spilsby. The inscription Lady Franklin herself composed for his London memorial reads in part, "Who by the discovery of the Northwest Passage won the victory that cost him his life." This was not quite the historical truth, but it was the truth she built with enormous effort and determination. The Arctic Council, the body that coordinated the search expeditions, produced a famous group portrait of all its members, a painting of bewhiskered naval officers sitting around a table studying maps, the British Empire at work, solving the problems of geography. John Ray, whose overland discoveries had done more to understand what actually happened than almost any of the naval expeditions, was not invited to sit for the portrait. The Franklin expedition became a kind of secular tragedy, the highest aspirations of civilization confronting the indifferent totality of nature. It was morality play, and adventure story, and cautionary tale all at once. The best equipped expedition in the history of polar exploration, crewed by experienced men, sent by the most powerful navy on Earth, swallowed without trace by the ice. If this could happen to Franklin, who had already survived the unsurvivable in 1821 and returned to do it again, then the Arctic was not a problem to be solved, but a force to be reckoned with. This lesson was not immediately learned. Britain sent more expeditions after Franklin, including the Nares expedition of 1875 to 1876, which attempted to reach the North Pole and failed with significant casualty. The Franklin expedition has never entirely left the popular imagination, and in recent decades, it has surged back with renewed force. Dan Simmons published a novel called The Terror in 2007, a fictionalized account of the expedition's final months that added a supernatural element, a creature from Inuit mythology stalking the men across the ice, as a way of dramatizing the psychological horror of the situation. The novel was praised for its historical research and its atmospheric density, and it became the basis for an AMC and BBC television series in 2018 that introduced the story to a new generation and sent thousands of people online to learn what actually happened. The show's refusal to resolve the mystery straightforwardly, allowing both the supernatural and the historical to coexist in ambiguous space, was thematically appropriate for a story in which so much genuinely remains unresolved. The Fitzjames remains identification in 2024, the ongoing archaeological work at the wreck sites, and the Canadian Museum of History's traveling exhibition on Inuit oral history and the Franklin expedition all suggest that this story is very much still being told, still being added to, still generating scholarship and popular interest in appropriately equal measure. The wrecks attract recreational divers in the brief summer window when the ice allows it. The graves on Beechy Island receive visitors, Tourists who take the specialized expedition cruises that now regularly pass through the Northwest Passage, standing for a few minutes in front of the headboards in the gravel, and thinking about what it means that the passage they are transiting by comfortable ship is the same one that killed 129 men. Research using ice cores from sites in the Canadian Arctic has established that the years 1846 to 1848 were among the worst for sea ice conditions in the region in many centuries, a period of unusually persistent, thick ice that would have prevented even a healthy, well-provisioned expedition from navigating the Victoria Strait. The ice that trapped the Erebus in terror was not ordinary pack ice in an ordinary year. It was exceptional, the product of climatic conditions that the expedition's planners could not have anticipated. The legacy is complicated by everything the expedition represents about empire and its assumptions. The men of Franklin expedition believed, as virtually everyone in Victorian Britain believed, that the world was there to be mapped and named and claimed, that the Arctic was a geographic problem to be solved. They named islands and straits and bays after themselves and their contemporaries, laying British nomenclature over a landscape that the Inuits had named and navigated for thousands of years. The disaster that consumed them was partly the disaster of that assumption, the belief that equipment and expertise and imperial will could overcome a landscape that was not amenable to being overcome. And yet, the men themselves, Torrington in his coffin, thin and 20 years old, Crozier writing his grim annotations on the Victory point note, some unnamed seamen boiling bones in a kettle to try and stay alive one more day, were not symbols of imperial arrogance. They were people in terrible circumstances, trying to survive. The Northwest Passage that killed 129 men in the 1840s is today increasingly navigable, not because of any technological breakthrough, but because the Arctic ice is retreating as the global climate warms. In the same month that the Terror was found in September 2016, a cruise ship called the Crystal Serenity made the transit of the Northwest Passage, carrying 1,700 passengers and crew. In 2023, someone crossed the passage by kayak. The route that generations of explorers died trying to find is now being used by tourists, and the waters that held the Erebus in terror for 19 months are now reliably open for part of the year. The Franklin expedition failed partly because the ice was too thick in 1846 to 1848. In the waters where those ships were trapped, you can today sometimes sail in a pleasure boat on a summer afternoon. The question of whether Franklin expedition ultimately succeeded or failed depends entirely on how you define both terms. By the measure it was trying to achieve, navigating the Northwest Passage, returning safely with scientific data, demonstrating the power of the Royal Navy and the capability of Victorian technology, it failed catastrophically and completely. By other measures, the expedition's failure was itself a kind of success. It drove 30 years of Arctic exploration that mapped the Canadian archipelago in unprecedented detail, settling geographic questions that no one had been able to answer before. The land we now know as Nunavut is mapped in the precision it is partly because so many expeditions went looking for Franklin and found coastlines instead. It also changed permanently how people understood the Arctic. Before Franklin, the dominant British view of the Arctic was that it was a challenge to be overcome, a geographic and meteorological problem to which sufficient technology, expertise, and national will was the solution. After Franklin, that view was tempered, though not entirely abandoned, by an acknowledgement that the Arctic had its own logic in its own terms, and that human beings who approached it on those terms, as the Inuits did, had a better chance of surviving it than those who approach it as if it were simply England with more ice. In the popular imagination, Franklin's name became something larger than the man himself. He was cast as a tragic hero, a Promethean figure who reached for the ultimate prize of geographical knowledge and was destroyed in the reaching. That reading is not entirely unfair, but it flattens a complicated reality. Franklin was also a man who had already survived catastrophe once, who was perhaps too old and not in the best health for the expedition he commanded, who led men into circumstances from which none of them returned. The tragedy, the heroism, and the failure were all real simultaneously, and none of them cancels the other out. The story of what actually happened, the 19 months locked in ice, the slow death of 24 men, the abandonment of the ships, the long and terrible walk south, the final weeks of cannibalism and starvation, is more interesting and more terrible than any of the myths that replaced it. And that story is still being told, still being refined, still being recovered from the ice. The night is long in the Arctic in winter, and the cold is very deep, and the silence is the kind of silence that has weight and substance. Somewhere in that silence, in the water, in the rock, in the memories passed from generation to generation by people who were there, the Franklin expedition is still happening, still unresolved, still asking questions that we do not yet have the full means to answer. That is perhaps the most appropriate ending for a story like this. Not a verdict, not a conclusion, but an ongoing reckoning with what happened in those waters and on that ice to those 129 men who sailed out in the confident summer of 1845 and never came home.